Lovely YouTube listeners. Welcome back to our podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of cultures and countries. I'm your host, Mira, and I'm thrilled to be here with my co-host, the one and only Leo.
Thanks. Mira, I'm glad to be back. And I'm sure our audience is to hear about our latest adventure. You know, between the previous podcast and this one, we had a crazy experience that I just have to share with you all.
Oh, boy. Do tell. I'm intrigued. What happened? Did you finally learn how to make a decent cup of coffee?
Ha! No, it's kind of like I said. Mira, it's not about the coffee. Although, that's a whole other story. Anyway, I was trying to order a simple meal at a restaurant, and I ended up getting the menu translated into about 5 different languages. It was like a comedy show in itself.
Oh, Leo, that's hilarious. I'm sure the waiters were confused, but I'm more curious about what you said to them. Did you try to use your famous Leo's language to communicate?
Mira, you know me too well. I did try to use my best Leo's language, but I think I ended up confusing the waiters even more. It was like a beautiful mess, and they just laughed and said, "Sir, please, just order something, okay?"
Oh, Leo, you're such a card. I'm sure it was a hilarious experience, and I'm sure the waiters appreciated your creativity. But enough about that. Let's get to the topic of the day. We're going to compare two countries that are often overlooked but are truly fascinating, the Marshall Islands and Taiwan.
That's right, Mira. And with today's podcast, we'll clearly reveal the differences between these two countries. We'll answer all the questions that are on your minds, whether you're visiting, moving, or even marrying someone from one of these countries. We'll be your comprehensive guide to help you make informed decisions.
And don't worry, we won't leave you hanging. We'll cover everything from culture, the economy, and education to food, nightlife, and even the cost of living. We'll be like your personal travel agents, but without the annoying travel brochures.
That's right, Mira. And as always, we're brought to you by the wonderful folks at Jetoff AI, who make all this possible. We're powered by their innovative technology and creative support. Thanks, Jetoff AI, for helping us make this podcast a reality.
Now, let's get started on our journey to the Marshall Islands in Taiwan. We'll explore the best and worst of each country, and we even share some of our own experiences and insights. So, grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and get ready to learn about these two incredible countries.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, so you can stay up to date with all our latest podcasts and adventures. We'll be right back after this break, so stay tuned.
Dive into the general safety and crime rates of Marshall Islands in Taiwan. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever heard of a place where the crime rate is almost non-existent?
Yes, the Marshall Islands, with its remote islands and tight-knit communities, have one of the lowest crime rates in the world. It's like a real-life paradise. Mira.
That's amazing. I've heard that the Marshall Islands are a great place to live if you want to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. But, Leo, what about Taiwan? I've heard it's a bustling metropolis with a vibrant city life.
Exactly. Taiwan is a bustling metropolis with a rich cultural heritage and a thriving economy. But, despite its urbanization, Taiwan also has a relatively low crime rate compared to other major cities in Asia. In fact, Taipei, the capital city of Taiwan, is considered one of the safest cities in the world.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners living in Taiwan would agree with me that the city is generally safe. But, Leo, what about the crime statistics? Are there any notable differences between the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. According to the latest crime statistics, the Marshall Islands have a crime rate of about 0.5 per 1. So I think that we can conquer that, while Taiwan has a crime rate of about 1.2 per 1. 0 people. So while Taiwan has a slightly higher crime rate than the Marshall Islands, it's still relatively low compared to other major cities in Asia.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural factors that contribute to the low crime rate in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the cultural values that promote safety in the Marshall Islands?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a strong cultural emphasis on community and family ties, which helps to promote a sense of responsibility and respect for one another. Additionally, the Marshall Z people have a deep connection to their traditional culture and values, which helps to maintain social harmony and reduce conflict.
That's beautiful. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the cultural values that promote safety in Taiwan as well. Leo, can you tell us more about the cultural factors that contribute to Taiwan's low crime rate?
Yes. Taiwan has a strong cultural emphasis on education and social welfare, which helps to promote a sense of social responsibility and respect for one another. Additionally, Taiwan has a well-developed social safety net, which helps to support vulnerable members of society and reduce poverty.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the economic factors that contribute to the low crime rate in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the economic factors that promote safety in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a relatively low cost of living, which helps to reduce poverty and promote social stability. Additionally, the Marshall Islands have a strong focus on sustainable development and environmental protection, which helps to promote a sense of responsibility and respect for the natural world.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the law enforcement in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the law enforcement agencies in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a small but effective police force that is responsible for maintaining law and order in the islands. Additionally, Taiwan has a well-developed law enforcement agency that is responsible for maintaining public safety and order.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the emergency services in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the emergency services in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a limited but effective emergency services system that is responsible for responding to emergencies in the islands. Additionally, Taiwan has a well-developed emergency services system that is responsible for responding to emergencies in the country.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the community policing in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the community policing initiatives in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a community policing program that is designed to promote trust and cooperation between law enforcement and the community. Additionally, Taiwan has a community policing program that is designed to promote social harmony and reduce conflict.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the crime prevention initiatives in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the crime prevention initiatives in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a crime prevention program that is designed to promote social responsibility and respect for one another. Additionally, Taiwan has a crime prevention program that is designed to promote social harmony and reduce conflict.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the victim support services in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the victim support services in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a limited but effective victim support services system that is responsible for supporting victims of crime. Additionally, Taiwan has a well-developed victim support services system that is responsible for supporting victims of crime.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the rehabilitation programs in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the rehabilitation programs in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a rehabilitation program that is designed to help offenders reintegrate into society. Additionally, Taiwan has a rehabilitation program that is designed to help offenders reintegrate into society.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the restorative justice programs in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the restorative justice programs in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a restorative justice program that is designed to promote healing and reconciliation between victims and offenders. Additionally, Taiwan has a restorative justice program that is designed to promote healing and reconciliation between victims and offenders.
Well, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the community engagement initiatives in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the community engagement initiatives in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a community engagement program that is designed to promote social harmony and reduce conflict. Additionally, Taiwan has a community engagement program that is designed to promote social harmony and reduce conflict.
That's great to hear. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the collaboration between law enforcement and the community in both countries. Leo, can you tell us more about the collaboration between law enforcement and the community in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a strong collaboration between law enforcement and the community, which helps to promote.
Tied into the world of politics and social harmony in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan, I'm to share some insights with you all, and I'm sure our listeners will be interested in hearing about these two unique countries.
Taiwan is definitely a fascinating case study when it comes to political stability and social harmony. With its complex history and cultural identity, it's a country that's constantly navigating its relationship with China.
That's so true. Leo, and the Marshall Islands, on the other hand, has a more laid-back approach to governance. They've got a unicameral legislature, which makes decision-making a bit more straightforward.
Yeah, but Taiwan's got a more complex system, with a president, a premier, and a unicameral legislature. It's like a mini version of the US system, but with its own unique twists.
That's a great way to put it. Leo, and speaking of unique twists, the Marshall Islands has a fascinating history of being a US trust territory. It's had a significant impact on their politics and culture.
Yes. The Marshall Islands has a rich history, and their connection to the US has definitely shaped their politics. But Taiwan's got its own unique challenges, like the threat of China's influence and the delicate balance between the two sides.
Exactly. And it's interesting to see how Taiwan's handled this situation, with a strong emphasis on democracy and self-governance. I'm sure our listeners living in Taiwan would agree with me that this is a crucial aspect of their country's identity.
Well, I'm not so sure about that, Mira, but in all seriousness, Taiwan's done a remarkable job in maintaining its independence and sovereignty. And the Marshall Islands, with its laid-back approach, has managed to maintain a sense of common stability.
Well, I think we can both agree on that. Leo, and it's interesting to see how the two countries have approached social harmony. The Marshall Islands has a strong emphasis on community and family ties, which is reflected in their social norms and customs.
Yes. The Marshall Islands has a very tight-knit community, and their cultural values are deeply rooted in their island culture. And Taiwan, on the other hand, has a more urbanized society, with a strong emphasis on individualism and personal freedoms.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to see how these cultural differences have shaped the social harmony in each country. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think our listeners think about the concept of social harmony in these two countries?
Well, I think our listeners are probably, what's the deal with Taiwan's politics? But seriously, I think they'd be interested in hearing more about the Marshall Islands' approach to social harmony and how it's worked for them.
I think we've got a great opportunity to share some insights and stories about these two countries. And for more insights like this, don't forget to check out Jet Off, where you can explore more country profiles and cultural insights.
Yeah, and if you're living in the Marshall Islands or Taiwan, you might want to check out Jet Off AI for some tips on navigating the local culture and politics.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm sure our listeners are now more informed about the political stability and social harmony in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Dive into the economic conditions and cost of living in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Both countries have unique stories to tell, and I'm to share them with you.
That's right. Mira, Taiwan has a thriving economy, with a strong focus on technology and manufacturing. It's a hub for international trade, and its GDP is one of the highest in Asia.
Ah, yes. But the Marshall Islands have a very different story. They're a small island nation with a limited economy, mostly relying on fishing and tourism. But what's interesting is that they have a unique economic system, with a focus on sustainability and environmental protection.
That's true. Mira, the Marshall Islands have made significant efforts to reduce their carbon footprint and promote ecotourism. But what about the cost of living? How do these two countries compare in terms of affordability?
Well, Leo, Taiwan is generally more expensive than the Marshall Islands. Housing costs, in particular, are quite high in Taiwan, especially in cities like Taipei and Kaohsiung.
That's right. But on the other hand, the Marshall Islands have a relatively low cost of living, especially when it comes to housing. However, the cost of imported goods can be quite high due to the country's remote location.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to live in a place with a very limited economy? How would you cope with the challenges of living in a small island nation?
Well, Mira, I think I'd find it quite an adventure. But seriously, I've lived in several small towns and cities around the world, and I think the key to coping with a limited economy is to be flexible and adaptable.
That's a great point. Leo, flexibility and adaptability are essential when living in a small island nation like the Marshall Islands. But what about job opportunities? Are there many job openings in the Marshall Islands? Or is it a challenge to find employment?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, the Marshall Islands do have a few job opportunities, mostly in the fishing and tourism industries. However, the job market can be quite limited, and it may require some creativity to find employment.
I see. And what about Taiwan? What kind of job opportunities are available in Taiwan? And how does the job market compare to the Marshall Islands?
Well, Taiwan has a much more developed job market, with many opportunities in technology, manufacturing, and services. However, the job market can be quite competitive, especially in industries like tech and finance.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever worked in a competitive job market like Taiwan's? How did you find it?
Well, Mira, I think I've learned to thrive in competitive environments. But seriously, I think the key to success in a competitive job market is to be proactive and persistent.
That's a great advice. Leo. And finally, let's talk about the cost of living in Taiwan versus the Marshall Islands. Which country would you say is more affordable? And why?
Ah, that's a tough question, Mira. But if I had to choose, I'd say Taiwan is more affordable, especially when it comes to housing and transportation. However, the Marshall Islands have a more relaxed pace of life, which can be a great advantage for those who value a slower pace.
I see what you mean, Leo. And I think that's a great point. The Marshall Islands may not have the same level of economic development as Taiwan, but they have a unique charm and beauty that's worth experiencing.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think that's what makes the Marshall Islands so special. It's a place that's off the beaten path, but still has so much to offer.
Well, there you have it. Folks, a comparison of the economic conditions and cost of living in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Both countries have their unique strengths and weaknesses, and it's up to each individual to decide which country is best for them.
That's right, Mira. And don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
And finally, a question for our listeners. If you're considering moving to either the Marshall Islands or Taiwan, what are some things you should keep in mind?
Ah, great question. Mira, I think one of the most important things to consider is the cost of living, as well as the job market and opportunities available in each country.
That's right, Leo. And don't forget to research the cultural and social aspects of each country, as well as the local customs and traditions.
Absolutely, Mira. And I think that's what makes this podcast so valuable. We're not just talking about numbers and statistics. We're talking about real people and real experiences.
Well, that's all for today's episode. Folks, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more episodes like this one.
Dive into the housing market in the Marshall Islands. It's a unique place, and I'm curious to know more about the types of accommodations available. Leo, what's your take on the local housing scene?
The Marshall Islands, a tropical paradise with a laid-back vibe. When it comes to accommodations, you'll find a mix of traditional island-style homes and modern apartments. But be prepared for a higher price tag, especially in the capital city of Majuro.
Higher price tag? Huh? That's what I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a tropical paradise? But for our listeners, especially those on a budget, I'm sure they'd love to know more about affordable options. Leo, have you heard of any affordable housing initiatives in the Marshall Islands?
Actually, yes. The government has been working on a program to provide affordable housing for low-income families. It's a great initiative. But, as you mentioned, it's still a challenge for those on a tight budget. I'm sure our listeners would agree that affordable housing is a top priority.
Absolutely. Affordable housing is a must-have for anyone looking to move to a new country. And speaking of must-haves, let's talk about safety features in homes. In the Marshall Islands, are there any specific safety concerns that homeowners should be aware of?
Safety concerns. Yes. One of the biggest concerns is typhoons. The Marshall Islands are prone to strong typhoons, which can cause significant damage to homes. So, it's essential for homeowners to take extra precautions, such as securing roofs and installing shutters.
Wow, typhoons are a serious concern. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to prepare their homes for extreme weather conditions. And switching gears, let's talk about the types of homes available in the Marshall Islands. Are there any unique or traditional styles that are popular among locals?
Yes. Traditional island-style homes are a staple in the Marshall Islands. They're often made from local materials like wooden thatch and feature beautiful architecture. It's a great way to experience the local culture and live in harmony with nature.
That sounds amazing. I can only imagine how peaceful it must be to live in a traditional island-style home. And for our listeners, I'm sure they'd love to know more about the cost of living in the Marshall Islands. Can you give us an idea of what to expect? Leo?
Well, the cost of living in the Marshall Islands is relatively high, especially when it comes to imported goods. But for locals, the cost of living is relatively affordable. However, for expats, it can be a challenge to adjust to the local prices.
I see. So it's a bit of a trade-off between affordability and lifestyle. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's worth it to experience the unique culture and lifestyle of the Marshall Islands. Speaking of unique experiences, let's talk about the housing market in Taiwan. What's your take on the local housing scene? Leo?
Taiwan, a country with a rich history and a thriving economy. When it comes to accommodations, you'll find a mix of modern apartments and traditional houses. But be prepared for a highly competitive market, especially in cities like Taipei and Kaohsiung.
Competitive market? Huh? That's what I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a vibrant city like Taipei? But for our listeners, especially those looking to rent, I'm sure they'd love to know more about the rental market in Taiwan. Leo, have you heard of any popular neighborhoods for expats to live in?
Actually, yes. The Bikini district in Taipei is a popular area for expats, with many modern apartments and a lively nightlife. However, it's also one of the more expensive areas, so it's essential to budget accordingly.
Budgeting is always a concern for expats. But I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any tips on how to navigate the rental market in Taiwan. And switching gears, let's talk about the types of homes available in Taiwan. Are there any unique or traditional styles that are popular among locals?
Yes. Traditional Taiwanese homes are a staple in the country. They're often made from local materials like wood and tile, and feature beautiful architecture. It's a great way to experience the local culture and live in harmony with nature.
That sounds amazing. I can only imagine how peaceful it must be to live in a traditional Taiwanese home. And for our listeners, I'm sure they'd love to know more about the cost of living in Taiwan. Can you give us an idea of what to expect? Leo?
Well, the cost of living in Taiwan is relatively high, especially when it comes to imported goods. But for locals, the cost of living is relatively affordable. However, for expats, it can be a challenge to adjust to the local prices.
I see. So, it's a bit of a trade-off between affordability and lifestyle. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's worth it to experience the unique culture and lifestyle of Taiwan. And speaking of unique experiences, let's talk about the differences between the housing markets in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. What's your take on the similarities and differences? Leo?
Great question. Mia, one of the biggest similarities between the two countries is the emphasis on community and culture. In both countries, you'll find a strong sense of community and a deep appreciation for traditional culture. However, the housing markets are quite different, with the Marshall Islands having a more laid-back and traditional approach, while Taiwan has a more modern and competitive market.
That's a great point. Leo, and for our listeners, I'm sure they'd love to know more about the pros and cons of each country's housing market. Can you summarize the key takeaways for us?
Well, if you're looking for a laid-back and traditional lifestyle, the Marshall Islands might be the perfect fit. However, if you're looking for a more modern and vibrant lifestyle, Taiwan might be the way to go. But either way, it's essential to do your research and budget accordingly.
Great advice. Leo, and for our listeners, I'm sure they'd love to know more about the final verdict. So, which country would you recommend for our listeners? Leo?
That's a tough one. But if I had to choose, I'd say Taiwan. The country has a thriving economy, a rich culture, and a highly developed infrastructure. Plus, the housing market is highly competitive, which can lead to better prices and a wider range of options.
I see. So it's a bit of a tie between the two countries. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that both countries have their unique charms and attractions. Speaking of attractions, let's dive into the bureaucratic jungle that is visa and immigration procedures. I'm sure our listeners living in Taiwan would agree with me that navigating the system can be a daunting task. Leo, have you had any experience with the Taiwanese immigration process?
Yes. The Taiwanese bureaucracy. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. But the needle is a 10-page application form. Seriously though, it's not that bad. You just need to make sure you have all the right documents. And you'll be golden.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys have any horror stories about trying to get a visa or residence permit in Taiwan? If you've been through it, share your experience in the comments section.
I think it's worth noting that Taiwan is a relatively straightforward process for obtaining a visa. You just need to fill out the application form, submit the required documents, and pay the fee. Easy peasy, right?
Easy peasy. But what about the Marshall Islands? I've heard it's a bit more complicated. Leo, can you tell us a bit about the visa process in the Marshall Islands?
Yes, the Marshall Islands. It's a bit more challenging, but not impossible. You'll need to submit an application to the Marshall Islands government, provide proof of citizenship, and go through a background check. But don't worry, it's not as scary as it sounds.
I'm glad you're breaking it down for us. Leo, so what's the main difference between the two countries' visa processes? Is it just a matter of paperwork? Or are there any significant differences?
Well, I think the main difference is that Taiwan has a more streamlined process, while the Marshall Islands have a more traditional approach. But both countries require you to provide proof of financial resources, health insurance, and a valid passport.
That makes sense. And what about the cost? How much do you need to shell out for a visa or residence permit in each country?
Ah, the cost. Well, Taiwan is generally more expensive, but it's worth it. The Marshall Islands, on the other hand, have a lower fee, but you'll need to factor in the cost of travel and accommodation.
Okay, so it's not just about the cost, but also about the overall experience. And what about the time it takes to process the application? Is it a quick turnaround? Or do you need to wait for weeks or even months?
The waiting game. Well, both countries have a similar processing time, but Taiwan is generally faster. The Marshall Islands can take up to 6 months, while Taiwan usually takes around to 3 months.
Okay, I think we've got a good understanding of the visa process in both countries. And what about the official procedures? Are there any specific requirements or regulations that expats need to be aware of?
Yes. The official procedures. Well, both countries have strict regulations regarding employment, education, and healthcare. But Taiwan has a more comprehensive system, with clear guidelines and support for expats.
That's reassuring to hear. And what about the Marshall Islands? Are there any specific regulations or requirements that expats need to be aware of?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a more relaxed approach, but still require you to comply with local laws and regulations. But don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds.
Okay, I think we've covered all the essential points. And finally, what advice would you give to our listeners who are considering moving to either country?
My advice is to research. Research. Make sure you understand the visa process, the official procedures, and the cost. And don't be afraid to ask for help or advice from locals or expats who have gone through the process.
Great advice, Leah. And to our listeners, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to help. And remember, the key to a smooth transition is to be prepared and flexible. Good luck, and happy travels. So, when it comes to healthcare, I'm sure our listeners in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan would agree that access to quality medical services is a top priority. Leah, have you dug into the specifics of the healthcare systems in these two countries?
Yes. I've been researching, and it seems that the Marshall Islands have a relatively well-developed healthcare system, considering its small population and remote location. They have a national health plan that covers essential services like primary care, hospital care, and emergency services.
That's great to hear. And what about Taiwan? I've heard they have a highly regarded healthcare system.
Indeed, they do. Taiwan's healthcare system is often cited as one of the best in Asia. They have a universal healthcare system that covers nearly the entire population, with a strong emphasis on prevention and community-based care.
Well, that's impressive. I'm curious. Leo, have you heard anything about the cost of healthcare in these two countries? As expats, we know that healthcare costs can add up quickly.
Yes. The cost of healthcare in the Marshall Islands is relatively low compared to many other countries. However, Taiwan's healthcare system is more complex, and costs can vary depending on the type of service and whether you have private or public insurance.
Okay, got it. So, let's talk about some of the cultural nuances surrounding healthcare in these two countries. I've heard that in the Marshall Islands, traditional healing practices are still widely used, alongside modern medicine.
That's right. In the Marshall Islands, traditional healers, known as Machua, are still respected and consulted for various health issues, particularly those related to mental and spiritual well-being.
Fascinating. And what about Taiwan? I've heard that they have a strong emphasis on traditional Chinese medicine.
Yes, that's correct. Traditional Chinese medicine is widely practiced in Taiwan, and many hospitals and clinics offer a range of services, including acupuncture, herbal medicine, and massage therapy.
I can see how that would be appealing to some people. And what about patient experiences in these two countries? I've heard that in Taiwan, patients are often treated to a more holistic approach to healthcare.
That's right. In Taiwan, patients are often encouraged to take an active role in their healthcare, and healthcare providers are trained to provide empathetic and supportive care.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. And what about our listeners in the Marshall Islands? Have they had any experiences with the healthcare system that they'd like to share?
Actually, I've heard from some expats living in the Marshall Islands that they've had positive experiences with the local healthcare system, particularly with the hospital in Majuro, the capital.
Great to hear. Okay, let's talk about some of the challenges facing the healthcare systems in these two countries. I've heard that in the Marshall Islands, there are concerns about the lack of specialized healthcare services and the high cost of medical evacuation.
That's right. The Marshall Islands face significant challenges in terms of accessing specialized healthcare services, particularly for serious conditions that require care from specialists.
Okay, got it. And what about Taiwan? I've heard that they face challenges related to an aging population and a shortage of healthcare workers.
Yes, that's correct. Taiwan's healthcare system is facing significant challenges related to an aging population and a shortage of healthcare workers, particularly in rural areas.
Ah, I see. Well, it's clear that both countries face unique challenges when it comes to healthcare. But overall, it seems like they're both making strides in terms of access to quality medical services.
Absolutely. And I think our listeners will find it helpful to know about the various healthcare options available in these two countries.
Okay, so that's what we discussed so far. In the Marshall Islands, the healthcare system is relatively well developed, but there are concerns about the lack of specialized healthcare services and the high cost of medical evacuation. In Taiwan, the healthcare system is highly regarded, but there are challenges related to an aging population and a shortage of healthcare workers.
That's right. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on prevention and community-based care, which is a positive trend in terms of healthcare.
Okay, got it. And what about our listeners? Do you have any questions or comments about the healthcare systems in these two countries?
Actually, I think our listeners might be interested in hearing more about the cost of healthcare in these two countries. Can we discuss that further?
Sure thing. Let's talk more about the cost of healthcare in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. I've always been fascinated by the Marshall Islands' transportation infrastructure, especially considering its remote location. I bet our listeners in this country relate to the challenges of getting around. Leo, can you tell us about the public transportation options in the Marshall Islands?
Yes. Public transportation is quite limited in the Marshall Islands. You'll mainly find buses and taxis, but they're not as frequent as you'd like. However, the government is working on improving the infrastructure, especially with the introduction of a new ferry service. Mira, I'm sure you'd love the scenic views of the Pacific Ocean while traveling by ferry.
That's true. Leo, but let's talk about Taiwan's transportation system. With its high population density, Taiwan has invested heavily in its public transportation network. I've heard that Taipei has an impressive metro system, and I'm curious to know more about it. Leo, what can you tell us about Taipei's metro system?
Taipei's metro system is indeed one of the best in the world. It's efficient, clean, and well organized. With a network of 6 lines, it's easy to get around the city. Mira, I'm sure you'd appreciate the convenience of having a metro system like this in a city with such a high population density.
That's impressive. Leo, I've also heard that Taiwan has a well-developed highway system, making it easy to get around the country. I bet our listeners who have traveled to Taiwan appreciate the convenience of having a good highway system. Leo, can you tell us more about Taiwan's highway system?
Yes. Taiwan's highway system is indeed well developed. With a network of high-speed highways, it's easy to get around the country. However, I must say that the traffic in Taipei can be quite chaotic, especially during rush hour. Mira, I'm sure you'd agree that navigating through heavy traffic can be a challenge.
Yes. Leo, I can imagine. But let's talk about the Marshall Islands highway system, with its limited infrastructure. the roads can be quite rough. I've heard that some of the roads are even unpaved. Leo, can you tell us more about the Marshall Islands highway system?
Ah, yes. The highway system in the Marshall Islands is indeed limited. With a lack of resources and infrastructure, the roads can be quite rough. However, the government is working on improving the infrastructure, especially with the introduction of a new road building program.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners appreciate the efforts of the government to improve the infrastructure. Now, let's talk about air travel in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. With their remote locations, both countries have invested in their air transportation systems. Leo, can you tell us more about air travel in the Marshall Islands?
Oh, yes. Air travel in the Marshall Islands is indeed limited. With only one international airport, flights can be quite infrequent. However, the airport is well maintained, and the staff is friendly. Mira, I'm sure you'd appreciate the convenience of having a well-maintained airport.
That's true. Leo, I've also heard that Taiwan has a well-developed air transportation system, with several international airports. I bet our listeners who have traveled to Taiwan appreciate the convenience of having a good air transportation system. Leo, can you tell us more about Taiwan's air transportation system?
Ah, yes. Taiwan's air transportation system is indeed well developed. With several international airports, it's easy to get around the country. However, I must say that the flight prices in Taiwan can be quite high, especially during peak season. Mira, I'm sure you'd agree that budget-friendly flights are a must for travelers.
Absolutely. Leo, I'm sure our listeners appreciate the importance of budget-friendly flights. Now, let's talk about the challenges of transportation in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. With their unique geography and population density, both countries face unique challenges when it comes to transportation. Leo, can you tell us more about the challenges of transportation in the Marshall Islands?
Ah, yes. The challenges of transportation in the Marshall Islands are indeed unique. With its remote location and limited infrastructure, transportation can be quite challenging. However, the government is working on improving the infrastructure, especially with the introduction of new transportation technologies.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners appreciate the efforts of the government to improve the infrastructure. Now, let's talk about the importance of transportation infrastructure in Taiwan. With its high population density, Taiwan needs a well-developed transportation system to keep up with the demand. Leo, can you tell us more about the importance of transportation infrastructure in Taiwan?
Ah, yes. The importance of transportation infrastructure in Taiwan cannot be overstated. With its high population density, Taiwan needs a well-developed transportation system to keep up with the demand. Mira, I'm sure you'd agree that a good transportation system is essential for a country's economic growth and development.
Absolutely. I'm sure our listeners appreciate the importance of a good transportation system. Now, let's wrap up our discussion on transportation infrastructure and convenience in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. We've covered a lot of ground, from public transportation to air travel. Leo, can you summarize the key points for our listeners?
Ah, yes. Let's summarize the key points. In the Marshall Islands, public transportation is limited, but the government is working on improving the infrastructure. In Taiwan, the public transportation system is well developed, with a network of buses, trains, and metro lines. Air travel in both countries is limited, but Taiwan has a more developed air transportation system. Mira, I'm sure you'd agree that transportation infrastructure is essential for a country's development.
Absolutely. Leo, I'm sure our listeners appreciate the importance of transportation infrastructure. If you've got any tips or advice on navigating the transportation systems in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan, please share them with us in the comments below. I'm fascinated by the language diversity in the Marshall Islands. With over 90 languages spoken, it's a true melting pot. I've heard that the Marshallese language is the most widely spoken, but I've also come across references to English being the primary language for business and tourism. Can you tell me more about the language landscape in the Marshall Islands? Leo?
Ah, yes. The Marshall Islands are a fascinating case study. With such a high number of languages spoken, it's not surprising that English is widely used for communication. In fact, English is the primary language for government, education, and commerce. However, I've also heard that the Marshallese language is still widely spoken in informal settings, like family gatherings and community events. It's a great example of a country where multiple languages coexist.
That's really interesting. I've also read that the Marshall Islands have a unique system of using English loanwords in Marshallese. Can you tell me more about that? I'm curious to know how it affects communication.
Yes. The use of English loanwords in Marshallese is quite fascinating. It's a result of the country's historical ties with the United States and other English-speaking countries. As a result, many English words have been incorporated into the Marshallese language, making it easier for Marshallese speakers to communicate with English speakers. It's a great example of language evolution and adaptation.
I see what you mean. It's almost like a blend of languages. I'm curious to know how expats and tourists experience language barriers in the Marshall Islands. Do you think it's easier for foreigners to communicate in the Marshall Islands compared to other Pacific Island nations?
Well, I think the Marshall Islands are actually one of the easier Pacific Island nations to communicate in, especially for English speakers. The country has a well-developed tourism infrastructure, and many locals speak English as a second language. However, I've also heard that some Marshallese speakers may not speak English fluently, especially in rural areas. So, it's still important for visitors to be patient and respectful of the local language and culture.
That's a great point. I've also read that Taiwan is a great example of a country with a high level of language diversity, with over 13 indigenous languages spoken. Can you tell me more about the language landscape in Taiwan?
Yes. Taiwan is a fascinating case study. With over 13 indigenous languages spoken, it's a true linguistic treasure trove. However, I've also heard that Mandarin Chinese is the primary language of communication, especially in urban areas. But I've also come across references to Taiwanese Hokkien being widely spoken in informal settings, like family gatherings and community events.
That's really interesting. I've also read that Taiwan has a unique system of using Mandarin Chinese characters in Taiwanese Hokkien. Can you tell me more about that? I'm curious to know how it affects communication.
Yes. The use of Mandarin Chinese characters in Taiwanese Hokkien is quite fascinating. It's a result of the country's historical ties with mainland China and the influence of Mandarin Chinese on Taiwanese Hokkien. As a result, many Mandarin Chinese characters are used in Taiwanese Hokkien, making it easier for speakers of both languages to communicate.
I see what you mean. It's almost like a blend of languages. I'm curious to know how expats and tourists experience language barriers in Taiwan. Do you think it's easier for foreigners to communicate in Taiwan compared to other countries in East Asia?
Well, I think Taiwan is actually one of the easier countries in East Asia to communicate in, especially for English speakers. The country has a well-developed tourism infrastructure, and many locals speak English as a second language. However, I've also heard that some Taiwanese speakers may not speak English fluently, especially in rural areas. So, it's still important for visitors to be patient and respectful of the local language and culture.
That's a great point. Leah, I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about language barriers in Taiwan and the Marshall Islands. Have any of you experienced language barriers in either country? If so, how did you overcome them?
Yes. I think that's a great question. Mira, I'm sure our listeners will have some valuable insights to share. And for those who are interested in learning more about the language landscape in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan, I recommend checking out some of the online resources and language learning platforms available.
That's a great idea. And for those who are planning a trip to either country, I recommend being prepared for language barriers and taking the time to learn some basic phrases in the local language. It will make your experience much more enjoyable and enriching.
Absolutely. Mira, and remember, language barriers are a normal part of traveling and living abroad. Being patient, respectful, and open-minded will go a long way in overcoming them.
That's a great point. Leo. And finally, I'd like to ask our listeners to share their own experiences with language barriers in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about your experiences.
Ah, yes. Please do share your experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you and learn more about your adventures in the Marshall Islands in Taiwan.
So let's dive into the beautiful islands of the Marshall Islands and the vibrant island of Taiwan. Both countries have a unique approach to cultural diversity and tolerance. I'm curious. Leo, how do you think they compare?
Ah, great question. Mira, the Marshall Islands, with its Micronesian culture, has a rich history of cultural exchange with other Pacific Island nations. They've developed a strong sense of community and social cohesion, which is amazing to see.
That's so true. And Taiwan, with its mix of indigenous and Chinese cultures, has a fascinating cultural landscape. I've heard that Taiwan has one of the most diverse cities in Asia, with a blend of traditional and modern architecture.
Exactly. And that's what makes Taiwan so unique. They've managed to balance their cultural heritage with modernization, creating a vibrant and dynamic society. But I have to say, Mira, that the Marshall Islands have a more, let's say, relaxed approach to cultural diversity.
Oh, really? What do you mean by that?
Well, in the Marshall Islands, you'll often see people from different tribes and cultures living together in harmony. It's not uncommon to see a traditional islander living next to a Westerner or a Chinese person, and they all seem to get along just fine.
That's wonderful. And it's not just the people, but also the government. The Marshall Islands have a strong focus on preserving their cultural heritage and promoting social cohesion. They've even established a national museum to showcase their history and traditions.
Wow, that's great to hear. Mira, and I think Taiwan has a similar approach to cultural diversity. They've established programs to promote cultural exchange and understanding between different ethnic groups.
Yes, and it's not just about the government initiatives. The people themselves are also very open-minded and welcoming. I've heard stories of Taiwanese people who have adopted children from other countries and cultures, and they're just like, oh, my child is from another country, that they're part of our family now.
Ah, that's amazing. And I think that's what we need more of in the world, people who are willing to accept and love each other, no matter where they come from.
Exactly. And it's not just about love and acceptance, but also about understanding and respect. In the Marshall Islands, for example, they have a strong tradition of storytelling and oral history. They pass down their stories and legends from generation to generation. And it's a wonderful way to preserve their cultural heritage.
That's so fascinating. Mira, and I think Taiwan has a similar approach to storytelling. They have a rich tradition of oral storytelling, particularly in the indigenous communities.
Oh, yes. And it's not just about the stories themselves, but also about the way they're told. In the Marshall Islands, for example, they use a lot of gestures and body language to tell their stories. It's a very expressive and engaging way to communicate.
That's wonderful. And I think that's what makes cultural diversity and tolerance so important. It's not just about coexisting with people from different cultures, but also about embracing and celebrating our differences.
Exactly. And I think that's what we can learn from both the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. They've shown us that cultural diversity and tolerance are not just values, but also a way of life.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think that's what makes this podcast so special. We get to share these amazing stories and experiences with our listeners and inspire them to be more open-minded and accepting.
And I'm sure our listeners will agree with us. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a society that values cultural diversity and tolerance?
Well, maybe some people might not agree, but I think that's what makes this conversation so important. We need to keep talking about these issues and sharing our perspectives with each other.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think that's what makes this podcast so special. We get to have these conversations and inspire our listeners to be more open-minded and accepting.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Mira, thanks for chatting with me about cultural diversity and tolerance in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan.
Thanks, Leo. It's been a pleasure discussing this topic with you.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning into this episode of our podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning about cultural diversity and tolerance in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan.
And don't forget to leave a comment below and let us know what you think about this topic. We'd love to hear your thoughts and perspectives.
And if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, feel free to reach out to us on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks again, Leo. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this episode of our podcast. And so dive into the educational opportunities and language schools in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. I mean, who wouldn't want to learn about the unique teaching methods and innovative approaches that these countries have to offer?
That's right, Mira. And I'm curious to see how the Marshall Islands, with its rich cultural heritage, compares to Taiwan's cutting-edge education system. Let's start with the basics. What's the literacy rate like in the Marshall Islands?
Great question. Leo. According to the World Bank, the literacy rate in the Marshall Islands is around 95%. That's impressive, considering the country's small population and limited resources. And I'm sure our listeners living in the Marshall Islands would agree with me that education is highly valued in their culture.
That's fantastic. And in Taiwan, the literacy rate is also high, around 97%. But I'm intrigued to know more about the innovative teaching methods that Taiwan has adopted. Can you tell us more, Mira?
Absolutely. Leo, Taiwan has been at the forefront of educational innovation, with a focus on project-based learning and hands-on experiences. They have also implemented a unique program called IBT, which allows teachers to develop their own curriculum and teaching methods. It's really inspiring to see how Taiwan is pushing the boundaries of education.
Wow, that sounds like a really forward approach. And I'm curious to know more about the language acquisition process in both countries. Do you think the Marshall Islands' focus on traditional storytelling and oral traditions helps with language learning?
That's a great point. Leo, in the Marshall Islands, storytelling is a big part of the culture. And it's a great way to learn about the language and history. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that there's nothing like hearing a traditional story told by a local elder to really bring the language to life.
That's so true, Mira. And in Taiwan, they have a really strong focus on language learning, with the emphasis on speaking and listening skills. They've also implemented a program called Hanyu Pinyin, which helps non-Mandarin speakers learn the language. Have you ever tried to learn Hanyu Pinyin, Mira?
Oh, Leo, you know me too well. Yes, I have tried to learn Hanyu Pinyin, and it's not easy. Let me tell you. But seriously, it's a great system for learning the language, and I'm sure it's helped many non-Mandarin speakers communicate effectively.
Well, Mira, you're a natural, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the language schools and programs that are available in both countries. Can you tell us more about the options for language learners in the Marshall Islands?
Great question. Leo, in the Marshall Islands, there are several language schools and programs that cater to language learners, including the Marshall Islands College of the University of the South Pacific, which offers a range of language courses. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that there are also several online resources and language learning apps available for those who want to learn the Marshallese language.
That's fantastic. Mira, and in Taiwan, they have a really strong focus on language learning, with the emphasis on speaking and listening skills. They've also implemented a program called Hanyu Pinyin, which helps non-Mandarin speakers learn the language. Have you ever tried to learn Hanyu Pinyin, Mira?
Oh, Leo, you know me too well. Yes, I have tried to learn Hanyu Pinyin, and it's not easy, let me tell you. But seriously, it's a great system for learning the language, and I'm sure it's helped many non-Mandarin speakers communicate effectively.
Well, Mira, you're a natural, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the language schools and programs that are available in both countries. Can you tell us more about the options for language learners in Taiwan?
Great question. Leo, in Taiwan, There are several language schools and programs that cater to language learners, including the Taiwan Language Center, which offers a range of language courses. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know that there are also several online resources and language learning apps available for those who want to learn Mandarin Chinese.
That's fantastic. Mia, and I think that's a great place to wrap up our discussion on educational opportunities in language schools in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us. Mira.
The pleasure is all mine. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that both the Marshall Islands and Taiwan offer unique and innovative approaches to education and language learning. Dive into the world of climate and seasonal conditions. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to a place where the temperature fluctuates so much that you're sweating 1 minute and shivering the next?
I've been to places like that, but I think Marshall Islands might take the cake. I mean, have you seen the temperature graphs for that place? It's like a roller coaster ride of heat and humidity.
Exactly. And it's not just the temperature that's extreme, but also the weather events. I'm sure our listeners living in the Marshall Islands would agree with me that cyclones and typhoons are a major concern.
Absolutely. And it's not just the intensity of the storms, but also the frequency. I mean, Taiwan, our other country of comparison, has its own share of typhoons, but at least they're more predictable.
That's a good point. But I think the Marshall Islands have a unique challenge with their location in the Pacific. I'm curious, Leo, what do you think is the biggest adaptation challenge for people living in the Marshall Islands?
That's a tough one. I think it would be the combination of sea level rise and the increasing frequency of extreme weather events. It's like they're facing a perfect storm of climate-related challenges.
I see what you did there. Perfect storm. But seriously, it's a serious concern. And I think Taiwan has its own set of challenges with typhoons and earthquakes.
Exactly. And it's not just the natural disasters, but also the impact on infrastructure and daily life. I mean, have you seen the pictures of the damage caused by typhoons in Taiwan? It's like a war zone.
Wow, that's a strong image. But I think it's also important to note that both countries have made significant progress in terms of disaster preparedness and response.
Yes. I think that's a great point. And it's not just the government, but also the communities that are taking initiative to prepare for and respond to these events.
That's right. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have unique cultural adaptations to deal with the climate and seasonal conditions.
Absolutely. I mean, in Taiwan, they have this amazing tradition of using windbreaks and other innovative techniques to mitigate the effects of typhoons.
Oh, I didn't know that. And in the Marshall Islands, I've heard that they have a strong tradition of using traditional knowledge to predict weather patterns.
Exactly. And it's not just the traditional knowledge, but also the modern technologies that are being used to predict and prepare for these events.
I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on sustainability and environmental protection.
Absolutely. I mean, Taiwan has made significant strides in terms of renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions.
That's right. And I think the Marshall Islands are also taking steps towards sustainability, although it's a bit more challenging due to the location and resources.
Exactly. But I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a strong sense of community and resilience in the face of adversity.
I completely agree. And I think that's something that we can all learn from. So, let's take a moment to appreciate the resilience of our listeners living in these countries.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that we can all take steps to reduce our carbon footprint and support sustainability efforts in these countries.
That's a great point. And I think it's also worth mentioning that there are many organizations and initiatives working to support climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts in these countries.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that we can all make a difference by being more mindful of our consumption and waste habits.
I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth noting that education and awareness are key to addressing climate change and promoting sustainability.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we can all work together to achieve.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today's topic. But I'm curious. Leo, what do you think our listeners would like to know more about when it comes to climate and seasonal conditions?
I think they would like to know more about the specific challenges and adaptations in each country, and how they can support sustainability efforts.
Oh, that's a great point. And I think it's also worth noting that we can all learn from each other's experiences and perspectives.
Exactly. And I think it's also worth noting that we can all make a difference by being more mindful of our actions and their impact on the environment.
I see what you mean. And I think it's also worth mentioning that there are many resources available for learning more about climate change and sustainability.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that we can all take steps to reduce our carbon footprint and support sustainability efforts in our own communities.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But I'm sure our listeners will have many more questions and insights to share.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this podcast so special. We get to learn from each other and share our perspectives and experiences.
I completely agree. And I think that's something that we can all appreciate. I'm to dive into the fascinating world of food culture and nutritional alternatives in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Let's start with the Marshall Islands, where traditional meals often feature fresh seafood, coconuts, and tropical fruits. Their staple dish, pei, is a fisherman's stew made with fish, coconut milk, and vegetables. I'm certain that our listeners living in this country would agree with me that seafood is a staple in many Pacific Island cuisines.
That's right, Mira. And what's interesting is that the Marshall Islands also have a unique tradition of kayabue, which is a type of fermented fish sauce that's used to add flavor to dishes. It's a bit of an acquired taste, but I'm sure it's an acquired habit for the locals.
Yes, and I'm sure that our listeners would be curious to know more about this unique tradition. In Taiwan, on the other hand, we have a rich culinary heritage that's heavily influenced by Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous cultures. Their street food scene is legendary, with popular dishes like beef noodle soup, oyster omelette, and stinky tofu.
Oh, stinky tofu. That's a favorite of mine. Mira. And what's interesting is that Taiwan has a thriving night market culture, where vendors sell a wide variety of street food, from snacks to full meals. It's a great way to experience the local flavors and culture.
That's true. And did you know that Taiwan has a unique tradition of night markets where vendors sell a wide variety of street food? From snacks to full meals, it's a great way to experience the local flavors and culture. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you tried stinky tofu or other street foods in Taiwan?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners would be to know that stinky tofu is actually a delicacy in Taiwan. It's made from fermented tofu that's been deep fried and served with a side of garlic and chili sauce. It's an acquired taste, but many locals love it.
That's fascinating. Leah, and I'm sure that our listeners would be interested to know more about the health benefits of traditional Taiwanese cuisine. For example, Taiwanese people often eat a lot of steamed vegetables, which are rich in fiber and vitamins.
That's right, Mira. And what's interesting is that Taiwanese cuisine also has a strong emphasis on fermented foods, like kimchi and pickled vegetables, which are rich in probiotics and other nutrients. It's a great way to support digestive health and immune function.
That's true. Leo, and did you know that the Marshall Islands also have a strong emphasis on fermented foods, like kayabue, which I mentioned earlier? It's a type of fermented fish sauce that's used to add flavor to dishes. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about fermented foods. Do you have any favorite fermented dishes or ingredients?
Well, Mira, I think our listeners would be to know that fermented foods are actually a staple in many Pacific Island cuisines, including the Marshall Islands. They're a great way to add flavor and nutrients to traditional dishes.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure that our listeners would be interested to know more about the culinary traditions of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. For example, what are some of the unique ingredients or cooking methods that are used in each country?
That's a great question. Mira, and what's interesting is that the Marshall Islands use a lot of coconut milk and tropical fruits in their cooking, while Taiwan uses a lot of soy sauce, garlic, and ginger to add flavor to their dishes. It's a great way to experience the local flavors and culture.
That's true. And I'm sure that our listeners would be interested to know more about the health benefits of traditional Marshall Island cuisine. For example, what are some of the key nutrients and antioxidants that are found in their traditional dishes?
That's a great question, Mira. And what's interesting is that traditional Marshall Island cuisine is rich in omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D, and other nutrients that are important for heart health and immune function. It's a great way to support overall health and well-being.
That's fascinating. Leo. And I'm sure listeners would be interested to know more about the cultural significance of food in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. For example, what role does food play in traditional ceremonies and celebrations?
That's a great question, Mira. And what's interesting is that food plays a central role in many traditional ceremonies and celebrations in both countries. For example, in the Marshall Islands, traditional meals are often served during special occasions like weddings and holidays. While in Taiwan, traditional dishes are often served during festivals and celebrations like the Lunar New Year.
That's true, Leo. And I'm sure that our listeners would be interested to know more about the culinary traditions of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. For example, what are some of the unique desserts or sweet treats that are popular in each country?
That's a great question, Mira. And what's interesting is that the Marshall Islands have a unique tradition of tapioca pudding, which is made from tapioca starch, coconut milk, and sugar. It's a sweet and creamy dessert that's popular during special occasions.
That sounds delicious. Leo? And what about Taiwan? What are some of the unique desserts or sweet treats that are popular in Taiwan?
Well, Mira, Taiwan has a rich tradition of desserts and sweet treats, including bubble tea, which is a popular drink made from milk tea, tapioca pearls, and fruit flavors. It's a fun and refreshing drink that's perfect for hot summer days.
That sounds like a fun drink. Leo? And I'm sure that our listeners would be interested to know more about the cultural significance of food in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. For example, what role does food play in traditional storytelling and cultural heritage?
That's a great question, Mira. And what's interesting is that food plays a central role in many traditional stories and cultural heritage in both countries. For example, in the Marshall Islands, traditional meals are often served during special occasions like weddings and holidays. While in Taiwan, traditional dishes are often served during festivals and celebrations like the Lunar New Year.
That's true. Leo, and I'm sure that our listeners would be interested to know more about the culinary traditions of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. For example, what are some of the unique ingredients or cooking methods that are used in each country?
That's a great question, Mira. And what's interesting is that the Marshall Islands use a lot of coconut milk and tropical fruits in their cooking, while Taiwan uses a lot of soy sauce, garlic, and ginger to add flavor to their.
When it comes to historical, cultural, and artistic values, Marshall Islands and Taiwan are two countries that stand out for their unique contributions to the world. From ancient landmarks to thriving art scenes and deep-rooted traditions, let's dive into their rich heritage. Jet off. AI loves uncovering stories like this, and so do we.
That's right, Mira. Marshall Islands, with its rich Polynesian heritage, boasts a fascinating history that spans thousands of years. From the ancient Marshalsea temples to the modern-day buildings, the country's architecture is a testament to its resilience and adaptability.
And what about Taiwan? Leo? Taiwan's cultural landscape is a fascinating blend of indigenous, Chinese, and Japanese influences. From the stunning temples of Taipei to the vibrant night markets, there's always something new to discover.
Exactly. Taiwan's night markets are a must-visit experience. With their delicious street food, lively atmosphere, and unique shopping opportunities. But did you know that Marshall Islands also has its own unique night market culture, albeit on a smaller scale?
Really? I didn't know that. I'm curious. What kind of night markets can we find in Marshall Islands?
Well, Mira, while they may not be as large as Taiwan's night markets, the night markets in Marshall Islands offer a unique glimpse into the country's culture and traditions. From traditional handicrafts to local cuisine, there's always something to discover.
That's so cool. I'm sure our listeners living in Marshall Islands would agree with me that their night markets are a true reflection of their culture. And speaking of culture, let's talk about Taiwan's indigenous communities. Can you tell us more about them? Leo?
Oh, yes. Taiwan's indigenous communities are an integral part of the country's cultural heritage. From the Amas to the Isle, each community has its own unique traditions, languages, and customs. And did you know that Marshall Islands also has its own indigenous community? The Marshall Z people?
Well, I didn't know that. The Marshall Z people have a rich cultural heritage, with their own language, customs, and traditions. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about them. Leah, can you tell us more about the Marshall Z people's connection to the ocean?
Ah, yes. The Marshall Z people have a deep connection to the ocean, with their traditional fishing practices and stories of the sea goddess, Aroi J. And speaking of goddesses, Taiwan also has its own unique mythology, with the goddess Matsu being a prominent figure in Taiwanese culture.
That's fascinating. Leo, Matsu is indeed a revered figure in Taiwanese culture, and her legend has been passed down through generations. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about the Marshall Z people's connection to their ancestors. Can you tell us more about it? Leo?
Ah, yes. The Marshall Z people have a deep respect for their ancestors, with their traditional burial grounds and rituals being an integral part of their cultural heritage. And speaking of heritage, Taiwan's cultural landscape is also shaped by its unique blend of traditional and modern architecture.
That's right. Leo! Taiwan's architecture is a testament to its rich cultural heritage, with its blend of traditional Chinese and modern buildings. And I'm sure our listeners would love to see more of it. Leo, can you tell us more about the architecture of Marshall Islands?
Ah, yes. Marshall Islands architecture is a unique blend of traditional Marshall Z and modern influences, with its traditional thatched huts and modern buildings being a testament to the country's resilience and adaptability.
That's fascinating. Leo, Marshall Islands architecture is indeed a unique reflection of its culture and traditions. And speaking of traditions, let's talk about the festivals in Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Can you tell us more about them? Leo?
Ah, yes. Marshall Islands has its own unique festivals, such as the Iniko Festival, which celebrates the country's traditional fishing practices in connection to the ocean. And Taiwan has its own unique festivals, such as the Lantern Festival, which celebrates the country's rich cultural heritage.
That's so cool. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these festivals. And speaking of cultural heritage, let's talk about the museums in Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Can you tell us more about them? Leo?
Ah, yes. Marshall Islands has its own unique museums, such as the Marshall Islands Museum, which showcases the country's rich cultural heritage and traditional practices. And Taiwan has its own unique museums, such as the National Palace Museum, which houses some of the country's most valuable cultural artifacts.
That's fascinating. Leo, these museums are indeed a treasure trove of cultural knowledge and a must-visit for anyone interested in learning more about Marshall Islands and Taiwan. And speaking of cultural knowledge, let's talk about the language of Marshall Islands in Taiwan. Can you tell us more about them? Leo?
Yes. Marshall Islands has its own unique language, with its own alphabet and grammar. And Taiwan has its own unique languages, such as Taiwanese Hokkien and Hakka, which are spoken by the country's indigenous communities.
That's so cool. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these languages. And speaking of languages, let's talk about the written language of Marshall Islands in Taiwan. Can you tell us more about them? Leo?
Yes. Marshall Islands has its own unique written language, with its own alphabet and grammar, and Taiwan has its own unique written languages, such as Chinese characters and Taiwanese script.
That's fascinating. Leo, These written languages are indeed a unique reflection of the cultural heritage of Marshall Islands and Taiwan. And speaking of cultural heritage, let's wrap up our conversation about the historical, cultural, and artistic values of Marshall Islands and Taiwan. On to talk about the natural beauties and landscapes of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Both countries have unique and breathtaking scenery. But let's start with the Marshall Islands. Have you ever heard of the incredible crystal clear waters of Bikini Atoll?
Ah, yes. I've seen pictures. And it looks like a dream come true. The atoll is surrounded by a stunning coral reef. And the waters are so clear you can see fish swimming beneath the surface. I'm sure our listeners living in the Marshall Islands would agree with me that it's a true natural wonder.
Exactly. And it's not just the water that's impressive. The islands themselves are covered in lush green forests and have beautiful white sandy beaches. But what really sets the Marshall Islands apart is its rich marine life. Have you heard about the incredible sea turtles that call these waters home?
Wow, that's amazing. I've heard that the Marshall Islands are one of the best places in the world to see sea turtles. And I'm curious, Mira, have you ever had a chance to snorkel or scuba dive in these waters?
Actually, I have. And let me tell you, it was an unforgettable experience. The sea turtles were so gentle and curious, and the coral reefs were teeming with life. But I have to say, Taiwan has some pretty impressive natural scenery too. Have you ever been to Taroko National Park?
Ah, yes. I've been to Taroko. And it's breathtaking. The marble-walled cliffs and sparkling rivers create a stunning landscape that's perfect for hiking and exploring. And I've heard that the park is also home to some of the most beautiful waterfalls in the world.
That's right. And the best part is that Taroko National Park is easily accessible from major cities like Taipei and Taichung. But what really sets Taiwan apart is its unique geology. The country is home to some of the most dramatic and rugged landscapes on the planet.
I know, right? I've seen pictures of the Taroko Gorge, and it's like nothing I've ever seen before. The sheer scale and beauty of the gorge is awe-inspiring. And I'm curious, Mira, have you ever hiked through the gorge?
Actually, I have. And let me tell you, it was an incredible experience. The hike was challenging, but the scenery was well worth it. And I have to say, the Marshall Islands and Taiwan have some similarities when it comes to natural beauty. Both countries have stunning coastlines and coral reefs, but they also have unique geological features that set them apart.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think that's what makes these two countries so special. They both have a unique blend of natural beauty and cultural heritage that's worth exploring. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this, but in all seriousness, the natural beauties and landscapes of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan are truly awe-inspiring. And I think that's something that we can all learn from.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to wrap up this criterion. But before we move on, I just want to say that I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you ever had a chance to visit the Marshall Islands or Taiwan? If so, please share your experiences in the comments.
That's a great idea, Leo. And I think that's a great way to end this criterion. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you in the next episode. So, let's talk about the Marshall Islands and Taiwan when it comes to sports and adventure options. I'm curious to know, Leo, have you ever tried surfing in the Marshall Islands?
Actually, I have. The waves there are incredible, and the scenery is breathtaking. But I have to say, I'm more of a beach bum than a thrill seeker, so I prefer to stick to lounging on the beach with a cold drink in hand.
Fair enough. But for those who love adventure, the Marshall Islands offer some of the best snorkeling and diving spots in the world. And did you know that Taiwan has some of the most beautiful hiking trails in Asia?
Really? I've heard of the Taroko National Park in Taiwan, but I didn't know it was that impressive. What's the most popular hiking trail there?
It's the Shakadang Trail, and it's a must-do for any outdoor enthusiast. But I'm sure our listeners in Taiwan would agree that the best part about hiking there is the stunning views at the Taroko Gorge.
I'm sure it's lovely. but I'm more interested in the sports scene in the Marshall Islands. I've heard that they have a national team for weightlifting, and they've even won some international competitions.
That's right. And did you know that the Marshall Islands also have a strong tradition of traditional sports like wrestling and stick fighting? It's amazing to see how they incorporate their cultural heritage into their sports.
Wow, I didn't know that. And I'm curious to know, what's the most popular sport in Taiwan?
Ah, that's an easy one. Baseball is the most popular sport in Taiwan, and they have some of the best teams in the world. In fact, the Taiwan national baseball team has even won some international competitions.
That's amazing. I didn't know that. And I'm sure our listeners in Taiwan would agree that the energy at a baseball game is electric.
Absolutely. And did you know that the Marshall Islands also have a strong tradition of traditional games like the tea game, which is a form of archery?
Really? I've never heard of that before. Can you tell us more about it?
Ah, sure. The tea game is a traditional game played by the Marshall Z people. And it's a form of archery where players try to hit a target with a bow and arrow. It's a great way to see the skills and talents of the Marshall Z people.
Wow, that's amazing. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Mira, can you tell us more about the adventure options in the Marshall Islands?
Sure. The Marshall Islands offer some of the most incredible adventure options in the world, including snorkeling, diving, and even shark cage diving. It's an adrenaline junkie's paradise.
Whoa, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding the Marshall Islands to my bucket list. And did you know that Taiwan also has some amazing adventure options? Like the Sun Moon Lake in the Toroka Gorge?
Yes. Did you know that the Sun Moon Lake is actually the largest freshwater lake in Taiwan? It's a beautiful spot for a relaxing boat ride or a hike around the lake.
Really? I didn't know that. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Mira, can you tell us more about the outdoor activities in the Marshall Islands?
Sure. The Marshall Islands offer some of the most incredible outdoor activities in the world, including kayaking, paddleboarding, and even jet skiing. It's a great way to explore the beautiful waters and coral reefs of the Marshall Islands.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding the Marshall Islands to my bucket list. And did you know that Taiwan also has some amazing outdoor activities? Like the Taiwan National Park and the Sun Moon Lake.
Yes. And did you know that the Taiwan National Park is actually one of the most visited national parks in Asia? It's a beautiful spot for a hike, a bike ride, or a relaxing picnic.
Really? I didn't know that. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Mira, can you tell us more about the cultural events in the Marshall Islands?
Sure. The Marshall Islands have a rich cultural heritage, and there are many cultural events throughout the year that celebrate the Marshall Z culture. From traditional dances to music and art exhibitions, there's always something happening in the Marshall Islands.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding the Marshall Islands to my bucket list. And did you know that Taiwan also has some amazing cultural events? Like the Taipei Festival and the Sun Moon Lake Festival?
Yes. And did you know that the Taipei Festival is actually one of the largest festivals in Taiwan? It's a beautiful celebration of Taiwanese culture, with music, dance, and art exhibitions.
Really? I didn't know that. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. Mira, can you tell us more about the adventure options in Taiwan?
Sure. Taiwan offers some of the most incredible adventure options in Asia, including hiking, biking, and even skydiving. It's an adrenaline junkie's paradise.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding Taiwan to my bucket list. And did you know that the Marshall Islands also have some amazing adventure options? Like the snorkeling and diving spots.
Yes. And Did you know that the snorkeling and diving spots in the Marshall Islands are actually some of the best in the world? It's a great way to see the incredible marine life and coral reefs of the Marshall Islands.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding the Marshall Islands to my bucket list. And did you know that Taiwan also has some amazing snorkeling and diving spots?
Ah, yes. And did you know that the Taiwan National Park has some of the most beautiful snorkeling and diving spots in Asia? It's a great way to see the incredible marine life and coral reefs of Taiwan.
Really? I didn't know that. And I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it.
And so to dive into the nightlife and entertainment scene in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Who else loves a good party?
I do. But let's get serious for a second. The Marshall Islands have a unique nightlife scene, with a mix of traditional and modern entertainment. They have a few bars and clubs, but it's mostly relaxed and low-key.
That sounds amazing. I love a good laid-back vibe. And have you heard about the traditional Marshall Sea dances, like the war dance? It's so energetic and fun to watch.
Yeah, I've seen videos of it. It's incredible. But, you know, Taiwan has a completely different scene. It's more urban and vibrant, with a lot of nightlife options in cities like Taipei and Kaohsiung.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys think it's better to have a more relaxed nightlife scene or a more vibrant and energetic one? Let us know in the comments.
Great question. Mira, I think it depends on what you're looking for. If you want to experience the local culture and traditions, the Marshall Islands might be the way to go. But if you want to experience the hustle and bustle of city life, Taiwan is the better choice.
Exactly. And speaking of city life, have you heard about the famous Taipei night market? It's like a giant party every night, with food, drinks, and shopping galore.
Well, that sounds amazing. I've heard great things about it. And, you know, the Marshall Islands also have a unique market experience. The Maduro Market. It's not as big as the Taipei night market, but it's still a great place to try local food and drinks.
Oh, I'm so down to try some local food. And I'm sure our listeners are too. So, let's talk about the entertainment options in both countries. What do you think is the most popular form of entertainment in the Marshall Islands?
That's a good question. I think it's a tie between traditional dances and modern music. The Marshalls love to sing and dance, and there are many talented musicians and dancers in the islands.
That's so cool. And in Taiwan, what's the most popular form of entertainment?
Definitely K-pop and Mandopop. Taiwanese people love their music, and you can hear it everywhere, from streets to restaurants to karaoke bars.
I can imagine. And, you know, I've heard that Taiwan has a lot of theme parks and amusement parks. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. Taiwan has some of the best theme parks in Asia, like the Taipei Zoo and the Shill and Night Market. There's so much fun, and you can try all sorts of delicious foods.
My stomach is growling just about it. And, you know, the Marshall Islands also have some great outdoor activities, like snorkeling and diving. Have you heard about the famous Bikini Atoll?
Whoa, that sounds incredible. I've heard about it, but I've never been there myself. But I've heard the diving and snorkeling are some of the best in the Pacific.
Exactly. And, you know, I think we've only scratched the surface of the nightlife and entertainment scene in both countries. But I'm so to continue exploring and sharing with our listeners.
Me too. Mira. And, you know, I think we should end this segment with a fun question. If you could attend a traditional Marshall Z dance performance or a K-pop concert in Taiwan, which one would you choose and why?
Ooh, that's the tough one. I think I would choose the traditional Marshall Z dance performance. I love the energy and passion of the dancers, and I'm sure it would be an unforgettable experience.
I can see why. And I think I would choose the K-pop concert. I love the music and the performances are always so high energy and entertaining.
Exactly. And, you know, I think that's a great way to end this segment. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media for more fun and informative content.
So, when it comes to family-friendly environments and children's activities, the Marshall Islands in Taiwan are quite unique. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever been to a country that's literally surrounded by water and coral reefs?
Actually, Mira, I have been to the Marshall Islands, and it's indeed a stunning place. The kids there love playing in the shallow waters and snorkeling with sea turtles. It's like a giant playground.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And Taiwan, on the other hand, is a hub for family activities, with its vibrant cities and scenic national parks. I'm sure our listeners would agree that Taipei's Elephant Mountain is a must-visit for families.
Absolutely. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a whole theme park dedicated to children's education and fun? The Taipei Children's Amusement Park is a treasure trove of interactive exhibits and rides that teach kids about science and technology.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' approach to family-friendly activities. What about the local culture? Leah, how do the Marshallese people celebrate family and children?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, in the Marshall Islands, family is at the heart of their culture. They have a strong tradition of storytelling and passing down their history and values to the next generation through oral traditions and community gatherings.
I love that. And in Taiwan, they also have a rich cultural heritage that values family and community. The Taipei City Hall's public spaces are designed to be family-friendly, with playgrounds, libraries, and even a children's library that offers story time sessions and interactive exhibits.
That sounds wonderful. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a program called Love Taiwan that encourages families to explore the country's natural beauty and cultural heritage together?
That's a great initiative. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' approach to education and childcare. What about the local schools and childcare facilities? Leah, how do they support families with young children?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, in the Marshall Islands, the local schools are small and intimate, with a strong focus on community and family involvement. They also have a program called Early Childhood Education that provides support and resources for parents and caregivers.
I see. And in Taiwan, they have a similar approach to education, with a strong emphasis on community and family involvement. The Taipei City Hall's Early Childhood Education program provides support and resources for parents and caregivers, as well as access to childcare services and education programs.
That's great to hear. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a program called Taiwan Family Day that encourages families to spend quality time together and explore the country's natural beauty and cultural heritage?
That sounds wonderful. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' approach to family-friendly accommodations and activities. What about the local hotels and resorts? Leo, are they family-friendly?
Ah, yes. In the Marshall Islands, the local hotels and resorts are designed to be family-friendly, with amenities like kids' clubs, game rooms, and even snorkeling equipment rentals.
That's fantastic. And in Taiwan, they also have a range of family-friendly accommodations, from budget-friendly guest houses to luxury resorts that cater to families with young children.
That's great to hear. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a program called Taiwan Family Fund that provides resources and recommendations for family-friendly activities and accommodations?
That's a great resource. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' approach to family-friendly transportation and getting around. What about the local public transportation? Leo, is it easy to get around with kids?
Ah, yes. In the Marshall Islands, the local public transportation is relatively simple, with a focus on community and family involvement. They also have a program called Marshall Islands Public Transportation that provides support and resources for families with young children.
I see. And in Taiwan, they have a similar approach to public transportation, with a range of options for families with young children, from buses to trains to taxis.
That's great to hear. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a program called Taiwan Transportation for Families that provides resources and recommendations for family-friendly transportation and getting around?
That's a great resource. Leo! I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' approach to family-friendly food and drink. What about the local cuisine? Leo! Are there any family-friendly restaurants or cafes?
Ah, yes. In the Marshall Islands, the local cuisine is a fusion of traditional and modern flavors, with a focus on family-friendly dining. They also have a range of restaurants and cafes that cater to families with young children.
That's fantastic. And in Taiwan, they also have a range of family-friendly restaurants and cafes, from traditional street food to modern cafes that cater to families with young children.
That's great to hear. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a program called Taiwan Family Dining that provides resources and recommendations for family-friendly restaurants and cafes?
That's a great resource. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' approach to family-friendly shopping. What about the local markets and shopping centers? Are they family-friendly?
Ah, yes. In the Marshall Islands, the local markets and shopping centers are designed to be family-friendly, with a focus on community and family involvement. They also have a range of shops and stalls that cater to families with young children.
I see. And in Taiwan, they have a similar approach to shopping, with a range of family-friendly markets and shopping centers that cater to families with young children.
That's great to hear. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a program called Taiwan Family Shopping that provides resources and recommendations for family-friendly shopping and markets?
That's a great resource. Leo! I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' approach to family-friendly healthcare and wellness. What about the local hospitals and healthcare facilities? Leo, are they family-friendly?
Ah, yes. In the Marshall Islands, the local hospitals and healthcare facilities are designed to be family-friendly, with a focus on community and family involvement. They also have a range of healthcare services that cater to families with young children.
That's fantastic. And in Taiwan, they also have a range of family-friendly healthcare services, from hospitals to clinics to community health centers.
That's great to hear. Mira, and did you know that Taiwan has a program called Taiwan Family Health that provides resources and recommendations for family-friendly healthcare and wellness?
That's a great resource. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall. Hey, have you noticed how some countries are really embracing the rainbow and becoming super LGBT friendly? I'm so to dive into this topic with you. Leo.
Totally. Mira, I think it's amazing how far we've come in terms of acceptance and inclusivity. And speaking of amazing, have you seen the Pride Parade in Taipei, Taiwan? It's one of the biggest and most vibrant in Asia.
Well, that's incredible. I've heard that Taiwan has been a leader in LGBT rights in Asia. But let's talk about the Marshall Islands, which is our first country. From what I've researched, it's still a bit of a challenging environment for LGBT individuals.
Yeah, that's true. However, I think it's great that the Marshall Islands are starting to open up and become more inclusive. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a place with crystal clear waters and stunning beaches?
That's a great point. Leo, but seriously, have you seen any initiatives or organizations in the Marshall Islands that are working towards greater LGBT acceptance?
Actually, I have. There's a local organization called the Marshall Islands Pride that's working to create a safe and welcoming space for LGBT individuals. And guess what? They're also planning to host their first ever Pride event in the near future.
That's fantastic news. Leo, I'm so impressed by the progress being made in the Marshall Islands. And speaking of progress, let's talk about Taiwan. I've heard that Taiwan has some of the most comprehensive LGBT rights in Asia.
That's right. Taiwan has been a trailblazer in terms of LGBT rights. They've got everything from same-sex marriage to protections against discrimination. And did you know that Taiwan even has a whole department dedicated to LGBT issues?
That's amazing! I'm so impressed by Taiwan's commitment to inclusivity. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that it's essential to have strong laws and protections in place for LGBT individuals.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's great that Taiwan is setting an example for other countries in Asia. But what do you think is the key to creating a more inclusive environment for LGBT individuals?
That's a great question. Leo, I think it's all about education and awareness. When people understand and accept the diversity of the LGBT community, they're more likely to be inclusive and welcoming.
I completely agree. Mira, and I think it's also essential to have role models and community leaders who can inspire and empower LGBT individuals. Do you have any favorite LGBT role models or inspirations?
Oh yes, I'm a huge fan of Lady Gaga, and I think she's an amazing advocate for the LGBT community. But I'm also inspired by local LGBT leaders and activists who are working tirelessly to create change in their communities.
That's so cool. Mira, and I think it's great that you're recognizing the importance of local leaders and activists. Because, let's be real, they're the ones who are really making a difference on the ground.
Absolutely. Leo, and I think it's also essential to involve our listeners in this conversation. So, I'm curious to know, what do you think our listeners would like to know about LGBT-friendly atmospheres in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
That's a great question. Mira, I think our listeners would love to know more about the local culture and customs in both countries. For example, what are some of the unique traditions and practices that make each country so special?
That's a great idea. Leo, and I think it's also essential to highlight the importance of cultural sensitivity and awareness when it comes to LGBT issues. Because, let's face it, different cultures have different norms and values, and we need to be respectful of those differences.
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's great that you're emphasizing the importance of cultural sensitivity. Because, as we all know, cultural differences can be both beautiful and challenging.
That's so true. Leo, and I think it's also essential to celebrate the diversity of cultures and traditions that exist in each country. Because, let's be real, that's what makes the world so fascinating, right?
Absolutely. Mira, and I think it's great that you're emphasizing the importance of celebration and appreciation. Because, as we all know, appreciation is key to building bridges and fostering understanding.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Folks, thanks for joining us on this journey through the LGBT-friendly atmospheres in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Don't forget to check out our next episode, where we'll be exploring the world of food and cuisine in these two countries.
And don't forget to follow us on social media, where we'll be sharing more insights and stories about LGBT issues and inclusive environments. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
I'm so glad we're talking about hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners, because I've had some amazing experiences in both Marshall Islands and Taiwan. In Marshall Islands, I was struck by the warmth and kindness of the locals. They welcomed me with open arms, and I felt like I was part of the community right away.
I can imagine. The Marshallsy people are known for their hospitality, and it's no secret that they're some of the friendliest folks on the planet. But what about Taiwan? I've heard that Taiwanese people can be a bit more reserved, shall we say.
Reserved? Oh, Leo, you're selling them short. Taiwanese people are incredibly warm and welcoming, especially once you get to know them. And they have this amazing concept called Gongsi, which is all about building relationships and connections with others.
Gongsi? I love it. I've heard of it, but I've never really experienced it myself. But I have to ask, Mira, have you ever had any funny experiences with Gongsi? Like, maybe try to navigate some complex social situation?
Oh, Oh, all the time. But one time that comes to mind is when I was trying to order food at a restaurant in Taipei. I didn't speak much Mandarin, and the waiter was being very friendly, but also very confusing. I ended up accidentally ordering a dish that I didn't even want, and the waiter just laughed and said, "Ugh, you're going to love this."
That's hilarious. And I'm sure it was a great learning experience for you. But what about Marshall Islands? Have you had any similar experiences there?
Actually, yes. When I was visiting the Marshall Islands, I was trying to learn some of the local language. And one of the people I was staying with, a kind old woman named Mrs. Taipei, took me under her wing and taught me how to say some basic phrases. But then she started telling me all these stories about her family and her culture. And before I knew it, I was laughing and crying and feeling like I was part of the family.
That's amazing. It sounds like Mrs. Taipei really took you under her wing. And I'm sure that experience has stayed with you to this day.
Oh, it has. And it's experiences like that which make me realize just how important it is to be open-minded and willing to learn when we're traveling. Because if we're not willing to take risks and try new things, we'll never really experience the culture of the place we're visiting.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially true when it comes to hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners. Because if we're not willing to be open and friendly, we'll never really understand the culture of the place we're visiting.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you guys have any experiences with hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners that you'd like to share? Maybe you've had a particularly memorable experience with someone from another culture. Or maybe you've had a difficult experience that you'd like to talk about.
Great question. Mira! And I'm sure our listeners will have some fascinating stories to share. But in the meantime, let's talk a bit more about Taiwan and its concept of Ganzi. Because I've heard that it's not just about building relationships, but also about building trust and respect.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Gumshi so unique. It's not just about being friendly and welcoming, but also about being genuine and sincere in our interactions with others.
And I think that's something that we can all learn from, regardless of where we're from and what culture we come from. Because if we're not willing to build trust and respect with others, we'll never really experience the full richness of a culture.
Well said, Leo. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this conversation about hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners in Marshall Islands and Taiwan.
Thanks. Mira, it's been a pleasure as always. And don't forget to tune in next time for more conversations about culture and travel.
Tied into the world of internet infrastructure and digital facilities in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever tried to find a decent Wi-Fi spot on a remote island?
No, but I can imagine it's not easy. The Marshall Islands have made significant strides in expanding their internet connectivity, but it's still a challenge. Did you know that they're part of the Pacific Islands Forum's initiative to increase internet access across the Pacific region?
Wow, that's great to hear. I'm sure listeners living in the Marshall Islands would agree that having access to reliable internet is crucial for their daily lives. In Taiwan, I've heard that they're investing heavily in 5G technology. What's the latest on that front?
Yes. Taiwan is definitely a leader in 5G adoption. They're planning to roll out 5G services across the country by the end of the year, which will provide faster speeds and lower latency. That's going to be a game changer for digital nomads and remote workers.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the Marshall Islands can catch up with Taiwan's 5G ambitions? Should they focus on developing their own 5G infrastructure or rely on international partnerships?
That's a great question. Mira, while the Marshall Islands may not have the same level of resources as Taiwan, they can still benefit from international partnerships and collaborations. For example, they could work with companies like Google or Amazon to bring faster internet speeds to their islands.
I see what you mean. But what about the cost? I've heard that developing 5G infrastructure can be quite expensive. How will the Marshall Islands fund their efforts?
Good point. Funding is definitely a challenge for the Marshall Islands, but They can explore options like public-private partnerships or seek funding from international organizations like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank.
That makes sense. And what about Taiwan's digital infrastructure? How does it compare to the Marshall Islands?
Well, Taiwan has a well-developed digital infrastructure, with many internet service providers offering high-speed internet services. They also have a robust cybersecurity framework in place, which is essential for protecting against cyber threats.
I'm sure our listeners in Taiwan would appreciate that. But what about the Marshall Islands? How do they protect themselves against cyber threats?
Good question. The Marshall Islands have a relatively small but growing cybersecurity industry. They're working with international partners to develop their cybersecurity capabilities and protect against cyber threats.
I'm certain that our listeners living in the Marshall Islands would agree that having a robust cybersecurity framework is essential for their digital safety. And finally, what about the role of technology in modernizing the Marshall Islands economy?
That's a great question. Technology can play a significant role in modernizing the Marshall Islands economy. For example, they can leverage digital platforms to promote their tourism industry, or use e-commerce to increase trade with other countries.
I see what you mean. And what about Taiwan? How's technology driving their economy?
Well, Taiwan has a thriving tech industry, with many companies like ASUS and HTC driving innovation in fields like AI, robotics, and cybersecurity. They're also investing heavily in digital infrastructure, like 5G and IoT, to support their tech industry.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about Taiwan's tech industry. And finally, what about the future of internet infrastructure and digital facilities in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan?
That's a great question. The future of internet infrastructure and digital facilities in both countries will depend on their ability to adapt to new technologies and stay ahead of the curve. But with the right investment and partnerships, I'm confident that both countries will continue to thrive in the digital age.
I agree. Lito! On this topic, thanks for sharing your insights with us. And I'm sure our listeners have learned a thing or two about internet infrastructure and digital facilities in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below. I'm sure our listeners are curious about the shopping scene in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. When it comes to retail diversity, these two countries have their own unique charm. Let's dive into the world of bargain hunts and luxury finds.
Absolutely. And I'm to share my insights on this topic. The Marshall Islands have a limited but vibrant market scene, with a mix of local handicrafts and imported goods. You can find some amazing deals on traditional island crafts like wood carvings and shell jewelry.
That's so true. Leo. And Taiwan, on the other hand, is a shopper's paradise. From bustling night markets to high-end malls, Taiwan offers a diverse retail experience. I've heard that the night markets in Taiwan are a must-visit for any shopaholic.
Yes. The night markets in Taiwan are legendary. You can find everything from street food to high-end fashion at affordable prices. And did you know that Taiwan is also famous for its night markets, which are a great place to try local street food and drinks?
That sounds amazing. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in Taiwan. Can you tell us more about the night markets and what kind of products you can find there?
Well, the night markets in Taiwan are a great place to find unique souvenirs, try local street food, and experience the vibrant culture of Taiwan. You can find everything from traditional Taiwanese crafts to high-end fashion at affordable prices.
I'm sure our listeners would agree that shopping in Taiwan is a treat. But what about the Marshall Islands? How does the shopping scene compare to Taiwan?
The Marshall Islands have a more limited shopping scene, but what they lack in quantity, they make up for in quality. You can find some amazing deals on traditional island crafts and local products, which make great souvenirs.
That's so true. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the local products and handicrafts in the Marshall Islands. Can you tell us more about the types of products you can find there?
Well, the Marshall Islands are known for their traditional island crafts, such as wood carvings, shell jewelry, and woven baskets. You can also find some amazing local products like coconut oil, vanilla, and other tropical fruits.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And what about the price-performance balance in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan? How does it compare?
The price-performance balance in both countries is quite different. In the Marshall Islands, you can find some amazing deals on local products, but the quality may vary. In Taiwan, you can find high-end products at affordable prices, but the quality may also vary.
I see what you mean. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that shopping in Taiwan is a treat. But it's not always easy to find great deals on high-end products.
Exactly. Mira. And that's why I think the Marshall Islands have a unique shopping scene that's worth exploring. You can find some amazing deals on local products, and the quality may be better than what you find in Taiwan.
I'm not so sure. I think Taiwan has a lot to offer when it comes to shopping. But I do agree that the Marshall Islands have a unique shopping scene that's worth exploring.
Well, I think we can both agree that shopping in both countries has its pros and cons. But what about our listeners? Have they had any experiences shopping in the Marshall Islands or Taiwan?
Great question, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to share their experiences with us. Let's hear from them in the comments below.
Absolutely. Mira, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that shopping in both countries has its unique charm. Whether you're looking for traditional island crafts or high-end fashion, both countries have something to offer.
That's so true, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the shopping scene in both countries. Let's continue the conversation in the comments below.
Well, I think that's all for this criterion. Mira, but before we move on, I just want to say that shopping in both countries has its unique charm, and I'm sure our listeners would love to explore both scenes.
Absolutely, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that shopping in both countries has its pros and cons. But what about the next criterion? Let's move on to 23. Food and dining scene. Dive into the fascinating world of cultural events, festivals, and concert opportunities in Marshall Islands and Taiwan. I'm to share these insights with you. And I'm sure our listeners living in these countries would agree with me. Marshall Islands, with its rich Polynesian culture, boasts a unique festival scene that's a true celebration of life.
Yes. The Marshall Islands are known for their vibrant culture, and their festivals are a big part of it. But have you ever heard of the Taiwan International Balloon Festival? It's a spectacular event that takes place in Yilan County, and it's a must-see for anyone who loves balloons and festivities.
Balloons? That sounds like a fun event. But I'm sure our listeners in Taiwan would agree that their country has so much more to offer when it comes to cultural events. Like what? For example?
Well, Taiwan has a rich cultural heritage, with a blend of Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous influences. One of the most iconic events in Taiwan is the Sun Moon Lake Fireworks Festival, which takes place every year in Nanju County. It's a breathtaking display of fireworks that light up the night sky.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners in Taiwan would agree that their country has some of the most beautiful firework displays in the world. But what about Marshall Islands? What kind of festivals do they have?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have their own unique festivals, like the Ainu Festival, which celebrates the island's history and culture. It's a fun event that features traditional music, dance, and food.
I love the sound of that. And I'm sure our listeners in Marshall Islands would agree that their country has a rich cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. By the way, have you ever heard of the Atolls? I platform? These insights could have been possible without Atolls by referring to cultural trends.
Yes. Jetoff. IA is a great resource for anyone who wants to learn more about cultural trends and events around the world. But let's get back to our topic. Taiwan has a thriving music scene, with a variety of genres and styles to choose from. One of the most popular genres in Taiwan is Mando Pop, which is a fusion of Mandarin Chinese and Western pop music.
Yes. Mando Pop is a great genre. and it's been popularized by artists like Jay Chu and Wang Lihong. But what about Marshall Islands? Do they have a music scene?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a unique music scene that's influenced by their Polynesian culture. One of the most popular genres in the Marshall Islands is the Marshall Z folk music, which features traditional instruments and songs.
Well, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners in Marshall Islands would agree that their country has a rich cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
Yes. Our listeners in Marshall Islands would definitely agree that their country has a unique cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. And speaking of celebrations, Taiwan has a variety of festivals throughout the year, like the Taipei Lantern Festival, which takes place every year in February.
Yes. The Taipei Lantern Festival is a great event, and it's a must-see for anyone who loves lanterns and festivities. But what about Marshall Islands? Do they have any festivals that are similar to the Taipei Lantern Festival?
Yes. The Marshall Islands have a festival that's similar to the Taipei Lantern Festival, called the Kwajalein Island Festival, which takes place every year in September. It's a fun event that features traditional music, dance, and food.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners in Marshall Islands would agree that their country has a rich cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. For more, check out Jet Off. And explore the cultural trends and events in both Marshall Islands and Taiwan.
Yes. Jet Off. I is a great resource for anyone who wants to learn more about cultural trends and events around the world. And speaking of cultural trends, Taiwan has a unique tradition of dragon and lion dance performances, which are a must-see for anyone who loves martial arts and cultural heritage.
Oh, well, that sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners in Taiwan would agree that their country has a rich cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. If you have any comments or suggestions, please let us know in the comments below.
Yes. Our listeners in Taiwan would definitely agree that their country has a unique cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. And speaking of celebrations, Marshall Islands has a unique tradition of traditional dance performances, which are a must-see for anyone who loves cultural heritage.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners in Marshall Islands would agree that their country has a rich cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. By the way, have you ever been to a cultural festival in Taiwan or Marshall Islands?
Yes. I have been to a cultural festival in Taiwan, and it was an amazing experience. The food, the music, the dance performances, it was all so wonderful.
Yes. Cultural festivals are always a great way to experience the local culture and traditions. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that cultural events and festivals are an essential part of any country's cultural heritage.
Yes. Cultural events and festivals are a great way to experience the local culture and traditions. And speaking of traditions, Taiwan has a unique tradition of tea drinking, which is a must-see for anyone who loves tea and cultural heritage.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners in Taiwan would agree that their country has a rich cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. If you have any comments or suggestions, please let us know in the comments below.
Yes. Our listeners in Taiwan would definitely agree that their country has a unique cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. And speaking of celebrations, Marshall Islands has a unique tradition of traditional music performances, which are a must-see for anyone who loves cultural heritage.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. And I'm sure our listeners in Marshall Islands would agree that their country has a rich cultural heritage that's worth celebrating. For more, check out Jet Off. And explore the cultural trends and events in both Marshall Islands and Taiwan.
Yes. Jet Off. AI is a great resource for anyone who wants to learn more about cultural trends and events.
Hey everyone, let's talk about learning the local language in Marshall Islands and Taiwan. We've all been there trying to decipher the script, listening to native speakers, and practicing our pronunciation. But which country makes it easier for newcomers to pick up the local tongue?
Great question. Mira, so in Marshall Islands, the language is Marshallese, which is a beautiful and complex Polynesian language. However, it's not as widely spoken as other languages, which can make it challenging for learners to find opportunities to practice.
That's true, Leo. But I've heard that Taiwan has a more extensive language education system, with many language schools and cultural centers offering classes for foreigners. Plus, the Taiwanese government even provides resources for language learners, including online courses and language exchange programs.
That's right. Mira, Taiwan is definitely a more linguistically diverse country, with Mandarin Chinese being the official language, but also with many indigenous languages and dialects spoken by the native Taiwanese people. And, yes, the government does provide resources for language learners, which is fantastic.
So, let's talk about cultural immersion. In Marshall Islands, it's all about the community. If you're living in a village, you'll be surrounded by Marshallese people, and you can learn the language by simply participating in daily life. But in Taiwan, the cultural landscape is more complex, with a mix of traditional and modern influences.
Ah, I see what you mean. Mira, in Taiwan, you have the traditional Chinese culture, but also a strong influence of Western culture, especially in the cities. And, of course, the Taiwanese people are very proud of their language and culture, which can sometimes make it more challenging for foreigners to learn.
Exactly. And I think that's why it's so great that Taiwan has a strong language education system. They're aware of the challenges that language learners face, and they're doing their best to provide resources and support. I mean, have you ever tried to learn Chinese, Leo? It's not easy. Trust me.
Oh, Mira, you know I've tried. And, yes, it's not easy, but it's definitely worth it. And I think that's one of the things that makes Taiwan so great. The language and culture are so rich and complex, and there's always something new to learn.
Well, I think that's a great point. And I'm curious, what do our listeners think about this? Do you think that Taiwan's language education system is better than Marshall Islands? Or do you have a different opinion? Let us know in the comments.
Well, I think it's interesting that you bring up the idea of a better system, Mira, because, at the end of the day, it's not about which country has the best system, but about which country is the best fit for each individual learner.
Ah, I see what you mean, Leo. And I think that's a great point. Each country has its own unique challenges and opportunities, and it's up to each learner to find what works best for them. Maybe we can even do a follow-up episode on language learning tips and tricks, and share some of our own experiences and advice.
Sounds like a great idea. Yeah. And, who knows, maybe we can even get some expert guests to share their insights on language learning and cultural immersion.
Well, I think that's a great idea, Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear from experts in the field. Thanks for joining me on this episode, everyone, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more fun and informative content.
And don't forget to follow us on social media for more language learning tips and tricks, and to share your own experiences and advice with us.
And so to dive into the topic of safety and comfort for women travelers in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Let's start with the Marshall Islands. From what I've researched, it seems like the culture is very welcoming and respectful towards women.
That's a great point. Mira, the Marshallese people are known for their hospitality and kindness. But, as a woman traveler, you still need to be aware of your surroundings and take necessary precautions.
Absolutely, Leo. But what I love about the Marshall Islands is that it's a very safe country overall. I've read that women can walk alone at night without feeling threatened, which is a big plus.
That's true. But it's also worth noting that the Marshall Islands have a relatively low crime rate compared to other countries. However, as with any travel destination, it's always better to be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts.
I agree. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a strong focus on community and family, which can make it feel very safe and welcoming for women.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that the Marshall Islands have a relatively small population, which can make it easier for women to connect with locals and feel a sense of community.
That's so true. Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a lot of beautiful beaches and outdoor spaces that are perfect for women to relax and enjoy nature.
Ah, yes. The beaches in the Marshall Islands are stunning. But, as a woman traveler, you should also be aware of the local customs and traditions, especially when it comes to dressing modestly.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a relatively low cost of living, which can make it a great destination for women who want to travel on a budget.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that the Marshall Islands have a lot of opportunities for women to learn about local culture and history, which can be a really enriching experience.
I completely agree. Leo, and I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a strong focus on sustainability and environmental protection, which can make it a great destination for women who care about the planet.
Ah, yes. The Marshall Islands are a great example of a country that is working to protect its environment and preserve its natural resources. And I think it's also worth noting that the Marshall Islands have a lot of opportunities for women to get involved in local conservation efforts.
That's so cool. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a relatively small tourist industry, which can make it feel like a more authentic and off-the-beaten-path destination for women.
Ah, yes. The Marshall Islands are definitely a hidden gem for women travelers. And I think it's also worth noting that the Marshall Islands have a lot of opportunities for women to learn about local cuisine and try new foods.
I love trying new foods. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a relatively low risk of natural disasters, which can make it a great destination for women who are looking for a safe and stable place to travel.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that the Marshall Islands have a lot of opportunities for women to get involved in local sports and activities, such as snorkeling and diving.
Ah, yes. The Marshall Islands are a great destination for women who love the water and want to get involved in outdoor activities.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a relatively low cost of transportation, which can make it a great destination for women who want to travel on a budget.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that the Marshall Islands have a lot of opportunities for women to learn about local culture and history, which can be a really enriching experience.
Ah, yes. The Marshall Islands are a great destination for women who want a local culture and history.
Okay, now let's talk about Taiwan. From what I've researched, it seems like Taiwan has a lot of opportunities for women to travel and explore the country on their own.
That's true. Mira, Taiwan is a very safe and welcoming country for women travelers. But, as with any travel destination, it's always better to be aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Taiwan has a relatively low crime rate compared to other countries.
That's true, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Taiwan has a lot of beautiful scenery and outdoor spaces that are perfect for women to relax and enjoy nature.
Ah, yes. Taiwan has some of the most beautiful landscapes in the world. And I think it's also worth mentioning that Taiwan has a lot of opportunities for women to learn about local culture and history, which can be a really enriching experience.
Ah, yes. Taiwan is a great destination for women who want to learn about local culture and history.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that Taiwan has a relatively high standard of living, which can make it a great destination for women who want to travel in style.
That's true, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that Taiwan has a lot of opportunities for women to get involved in local business and entrepreneurship, which can be a great way to connect with the local culture.
Ah, yes. Taiwan is a great destination for women who want to get involved in business and entrepreneurship.
Okay, let's summarize what we discussed so far. Both the Marshall Islands and Taiwan are great destinations for women travelers, with a focus on safety, comfort, and community.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a lot of opportunities for women to learn about local culture and history, which can be a really enriching experience.
Yes. Both countries are great examples of how women can travel and explore new cultures in a safe and welcoming environment.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries have a relatively low cost of living, which can make it a great destination for women who want to travel on a budget.
That's a great point, Mira. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong focus on community and family, which can make it feel very safe and welcoming for women.
Oh, yes. Both countries are great examples of how community and family can come together to create a safe and welcoming environment for women travelers.
Okay, let's wrap up our discussion on safety and comfort for women travelers in the Marshall Islands in Taiwan. I hope our listeners found this conversation informative and helpful.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think it's also worth mentioning that both countries. So, let's dive into the legal systems of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. I'm curious to see how they compare. Leo, can you start by telling us a bit about the Marshall Islands legal system?
Yeah? The Marshall Islands have a common law system, which is based on British law. But, it's not like they're stuck in the past or anything. They've got a pretty modern constitution that protects individual rights and freedoms. I mean, who doesn't love a good constitution, right?
Huh. I love a good constitution. Leo. But, seriously, what are some key features of the Marshall Islands legal system? And how does it compare to Taiwan's?
Well, for one, the Marshall Islands have a relatively small judiciary, which can make it easier to navigate the system. But, on the other hand, they've also got a pretty limited access to justice, especially for remote communities. Taiwan, on the other hand, has a more developed judiciary and a much stronger tradition of judicial independence.
That's a great point. Leo, and what about individual rights and freedoms? Are there any notable differences between the two countries?
Oh, yeah. The Marshall Islands have a pretty robust Bill of Rights, which includes protections for things like freedom of speech, assembly, and association. Taiwan, on the other hand, has a more complex system, with some protections for individual rights, but also some limitations. For example, Taiwan has strict laws regulating free speech and assembly, which can make it difficult for activists and protesters to operate.
Ah, that's interesting. And what about the role of the government in the Marshall Islands? How does it compare to Taiwan's?
Well, the Marshall Islands have a pretty weak system of government, with limited checks and balances. Taiwan, on the other hand, has a much more robust system, with a strong president and a bicameral legislature. But, it's not like Taiwan is perfect or anything. They've got their own set of problems, like corruption and nepotism.
Huh. Yeah. Corruption and nepotism are problems everywhere. Leo. But what are some key differences between the two countries' legal systems? And how do they impact everyday life?
Well, for one, the Marshall Islands have a pretty relaxed attitude towards law enforcement, which can make it difficult to enforce some regulations. Taiwan, on the other hand, has a much more strict approach, with a strong emphasis on law and order. But, it's not like Taiwan is a police state or anything. They've got a pretty robust system of checks and balances to prevent abuse of power.
That's a good point. Leo. And what about the role of the media in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan? How do they compare?
Yeah, the Marshall Islands have a pretty weak media landscape, with limited access to information and a lack of press freedom. Taiwan, on the other hand, has a much more developed media landscape, with a strong tradition of press freedom and a vibrant press corps. But, it's not like Taiwan is perfect or anything. They've got their own set of problems, like government censorship and media bias.
Wow, that's a great point. And what about the impact of colonialism on the Marshall Islands legal system? How does it compare to Taiwan's?
Yeah. The Marshall Islands have a pretty complex history of colonialism, which has had a lasting impact on their legal system. Taiwan, on the other hand, has a more straightforward history of colonialism, with the Dutch and Japanese both playing significant roles. But, you know, it's not like Taiwan is a tabula rasa or anything. They've got their own set of historical and cultural baggage.
Yeah, we all have our own set of historical and cultural baggage. Leah, but seriously, what are some key takeaways from our discussion of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan's legal systems?
Well, for one, it's clear that both countries have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. The Marshall Islands have a pretty robust Bill of Rights, but a weak system of government. Taiwan has a strong system of government, but a more complex system of individual rights and freedoms. And, of course, there are plenty of other differences between the two countries' legal systems. But, you know, it's not like we're trying to pick a winner or anything. We're just trying to understand the complexities of these two countries' legal systems.
That's a great point. Leo, and what about our listeners? Do they have any thoughts on the comparison between the Marshall Islands and Taiwan's legal systems?
Yeah. I'm sure our listeners have plenty of thoughts on the matter. And, you know, we'd love to hear them. So, please, if you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to share them with us. And, who knows, maybe we'll even respond to some of them in our next episode.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Leo. But, for now, let's just say that we've had a great conversation about the legal systems of the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. And, who knows, maybe our listeners will learn something new and interesting along the way. Let's dive into the world of spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Both countries have unique approaches to wellness, and we're to share them with you.
I'm curious. Mira, have you ever tried a traditional Marshall's spa treatment? I've heard it's a truly immersive experience.
Actually, Leo, I have. And let me tell you, it was a real treat. The warmth of the Pacific Islands and the tranquility of the spa combine to create the perfect atmosphere for relaxation.
That sounds amazing. In Taiwan, we have a rich tradition of hot springs and spas as well. The Beauties hot springs, for example, are a popular destination for locals and tourists alike.
Oh, I've heard of those. Taiwan's hot springs are famous for their therapeutic properties, right? But what about the Marshall Islands? What kind of wellness options do they offer?
Well, Mira, the Marshall Islands have a unique approach to wellness that's deeply rooted in their culture. They emphasize the importance of balance and harmony in all aspects of life, including physical and mental well-being.
That makes sense. In Taiwan, we also see a strong emphasis on balance and harmony, particularly in traditional Chinese medicine. But what about modern wellness trends in the Marshall Islands? Are they catching on?
Actually, Mira, the Marshall Islands are starting to see a growing interest in modern wellness trends, particularly yoga and meditation. It's a great way for locals to combine traditional practices with modern techniques.
That's fascinating. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Have any of you tried yoga or meditation in the Marshall Islands or Taiwan? Please share your experiences in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have some great stories to share. But back to the topic at hand. Mira, what about healthy living options in the Marshall Islands? Are there any unique foods or ingredients that promote wellness?
Yes. The Marshall Islands are known for their delicious seafood, which is not only a great source of protein but also rich in omega-3 fatty acids. And let's not forget about coconuts. They're a staple in Marshall's cuisine and are packed with healthy fats and antioxidants.
Coconuts. I love them. And in Taiwan, we have a similar emphasis on healthy eating, particularly when it comes to traditional Chinese medicine. What about cultural attitudes towards wellness in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan? How do these countries view relaxation and self-care?
Well, Leo, in the Marshall Islands, relaxation and self-care are seen as essential parts of daily life. In fact, the Marshallese people prioritize rest and relaxation over work and productivity. It's a wonderful approach to achieving a balance in life.
That's a great point. Mira, in Taiwan, we also see a strong emphasis on work-life balance, particularly in the business sector. But what about relaxation and leisure activities in the Marshall Islands? Are there any unique experiences that tourists can enjoy?
Ah, yes. The Marshall Islands are home to some of the most beautiful beaches and coral reefs in the world. Snorkeling and diving are popular activities, and the crystal clear waters are perfect for relaxation.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the Marshall Islands' natural beauty. And finally, what about spa and wellness resorts in the Marshall Islands in Taiwan? Are there any recommendations for our listeners?
Oh, yes. The Marshall Islands have a few beautiful resorts that offer spa and wellness treatments, including the famous Atoll Resort. And in Taiwan, we have a range of high-end resorts that cater to tourists looking for a luxurious spa experience.
Great recommendations. Mira, I'm sure our listeners will appreciate these suggestions. In this episode on spa, healthy living, and relaxation opportunities in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more travel tips and cultural insights. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. Until next time, stay relaxed and happy.
And remember, folks, relaxation is just a coconut's throw away.
I'm fascinated by the unique blend of faiths in the Marshall Islands. Did you know that it's one of the most Christian countries in the Pacific, with a significant proportion of its population identifying as Christian?
That's right, Mira. And it's not just Christianity that's prevalent. You'll also find a strong presence of Buddhism and other indigenous faiths. It's a beautiful example of how different cultures can coexist peacefully.
Absolutely. I think what's especially interesting is the way the Marshall Islanders have incorporated their traditional faiths with Western Christianity. It's a fascinating blend of old and new.
And it's not just the faiths themselves, but also the way people practice them. For example, you'll often see people combining their Christian beliefs with traditional ceremonies and rituals.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever been to a traditional Marshall's ceremony? I'd love to hear about your experiences.
Actually, Mira, I have been to a few traditional ceremonies, and it's always been an incredible experience. The way the community comes together to celebrate and share their faith is truly beautiful.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences. Perhaps you could share a story about a particularly memorable ceremony you attended?
Sure thing. Mira, let me think for a moment. Okay, so one time I attended a traditional Marshalsea ceremony where they were celebrating the harvest season. It was amazing to see the community come together to give thanks for the food they had been blessed with.
That sounds wonderful. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the cultural significance of this ceremony. Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Of course. Mira, so, in Marshalsea culture, the harvest season is a time of great celebration and gratitude. The ceremony we attended was a beautiful example of this, with people singing, dancing, and sharing food together.
That sounds like a truly special experience. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cultural significance of this ceremony. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the traditional Marshalsea faiths that are practiced in the Marshall Islands.
Sure thing. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, there are several traditional faiths that are practiced, including the worship of ancestors and the spirits of the land. These faiths are an integral part of Marshalsea identity and are often practiced in combination with Western Christianity.
That's fascinating. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about these traditional faiths and how they are practiced in the Marshall Islands. Can you tell us a bit more about the worship of ancestors and the spirits of the land?
Absolutely. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, the worship of ancestors and the spirits of the land is a deeply spiritual practice that is tied to the natural world. People believe that the spirits of the land have the power to heal and protect, and they often seek guidance and wisdom from these spirits.
That's beautiful. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of women in traditional Marshalsea faiths. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure thing. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, Women play a significant role in the practice of traditional faiths, particularly in the worship of ancestors and the spirits of the land. Women are often seen as the guardians of spiritual knowledge and are often called upon to lead ceremonies and rituals.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of women in traditional Marshalsea faiths. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the significance of women's roles in these faiths?
Of course. Vera, in Marshalsea culture, women's roles are deeply respected and valued, particularly in the practice of traditional faiths. Women are seen as the keepers of spiritual knowledge and are often called upon to share their wisdom with the community.
That's beautiful. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the relationship between faith and community in the Marshall Islands. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure thing. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, faith and community are deeply intertwined. People come together to practice their faith and to support one another in times of need. This sense of community and support is a vital part of Marshalsea identity and is often celebrated in traditional ceremonies and rituals.
That's wonderful to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the relationship between faith and community in the Marshall Islands. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the significance of community in traditional Marshalsea faiths?
Of course. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, community is a vital part of traditional faiths, particularly in the practice of worshiping ancestors and the spirits of the land. People come together to support one another and to celebrate their shared faith.
That's beautiful. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the relationship between faith and the natural world in the Marshall Islands. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure thing. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, the natural world is deeply revered and respected, particularly in the practice of traditional faiths. People believe that the natural world has the power to heal and protect, and they often seek guidance and wisdom from the spirits of the land.
That's fascinating. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the significance of the natural world in traditional Marshalsea faiths. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the role of nature in these faiths?
Of course. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, nature is a vital part of traditional faiths, particularly in the practice of worshiping ancestors and the spirits of the land. People believe that nature has the power to heal and protect, and they often seek guidance and wisdom from the spirits of the land.
That's wonderful to hear. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the relationship between faith and the environment in the Marshall Islands. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure thing. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, the relationship between faith and the environment is deeply intertwined. People believe that the natural world is a gift from the spirits of the land, and they often seek to live in harmony with nature.
That's beautiful. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the role of environmentalism in traditional Marshalsea faiths. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about this.
Of course. Mira, in Marshalsea culture, environmentalism is a vital part of traditional faiths, particularly in the practice of worshiping ancestors and the spirits of the land. People believe that the natural world is a gift from the spirits of the land, and they often.
So, let's talk about social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. I'm certain that our listeners living in these countries would agree with me that promoting inclusivity and celebrating cultural differences is essential.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think it's great that we're comparing these two countries, which have unique approaches to social equality and diversity. In Taiwan, for example, they have a strong focus on promoting indigenous rights and preserving cultural heritage.
That's fascinating. I've heard that Taiwan has a very diverse cultural landscape, with many indigenous tribes and languages. And I'm curious, have you ever tried Taiwanese Aboriginal food? I've heard it's delicious.
Well, I haven't tried it yet, but I'm definitely going to now. And I agree with you, Mira, that promoting indigenous rights is crucial. In the Marshall Islands, they also have a strong focus on preserving their cultural heritage, but it's a bit more challenging due to the country's history and colonialism.
Yes, that's true. The Marshall Islands have a complex history, with many cultural and social changes brought about by colonialism. But despite these challenges, I've heard that the Marshalsea people are very proud of their culture and heritage.
Exactly. And I think that's something that our listeners can learn from. In Taiwan, they have a very strong sense of national identity, but they also recognize and respect the diversity of their indigenous cultures. And in the Marshall Islands, they're working hard to preserve their cultural heritage and promote social equality.
I'm curious. Leo, what do you think is the most important factor in promoting social equality and diversity in these countries? Is it education, economic development, or something else entirely?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's a combination of all those factors, but also something more intangible, like a sense of community and shared values. In Taiwan, for example, they have a strong focus on community-based development, which I think is really important for promoting social equality and diversity.
That makes sense. And I think it's interesting that both countries have a strong focus on community-based development. In the Marshall Islands, they also have a strong sense of community, but it's a bit more challenging due to the country's small size and remote location.
Yes, that's true. But I think that's also an advantage. In a way, the Marshall Islands have a very close-knit community, and that can be really beneficial for promoting social equality and diversity. And in Taiwan, they have a strong sense of national identity, but they also recognize and respect the diversity of their indigenous cultures.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that promoting social equality and diversity is more important in one country than the other? Let us know in the comments.
Well, I think it's definitely a topic worth discussing, Mira, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. I think it's really important to recognize and respect the diversity of our listeners' experiences and perspectives.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think that's something that we can all learn from. By promoting social equality and diversity, we can create a more inclusive and compassionate society, where everyone feels valued and respected.
Well said, Mira. And I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation on social equality and diversity in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Thanks for having this conversation with me.
The pleasure is mine, Leo. And I'm glad we could have this conversation. Let's move on to our next topic. Dive into the world of taxation for long-term immigrants in the Marshall Islands. I'm curious. Leo, have you heard of any unique tax structures that might interest our listeners?
Actually, Mira, the Marshall Islands have a relatively simple tax system, with a 20% income tax on earnings above a certain threshold. However, I've heard that some expats have successfully negotiated lower tax rates with the government. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about that.
That's fascinating. I'm sure our listeners would agree that negotiating tax rates is always a bonus. But let's move on to retirement plans. How do the Marshall Islands compare to other countries in terms of pension options for expats?
That's a great question. Mira, the Marshall Islands offer a pension fund that's similar to those found in other Pacific Island nations. However, I've heard that the options for expats are limited, and it's often best to bring one's own pension plan from their home country.
I see. So it sounds like the Marshall Islands might not be the best option for those looking for a comprehensive pension plan. But what about social safety nets? Do they offer any protections for long-term immigrants?
Well, Mira, the Marshall Islands do have a social safety net, but it's relatively basic compared to other countries. However, I've heard that the government is working to improve the system and provide more support for vulnerable populations.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any updates on improvements to the social safety net. Now, let's compare the Marshall Islands to Taiwan in terms of taxation, retirement, and social rights.
Taiwan is a great comparison. Mira, Taiwan has a more complex tax system, with a 10% income tax on earnings above a certain threshold. However, the government offers a range of tax incentives for expats, including a 20% tax credit for foreign income.
Well, that sounds like a great deal for expats. But what about retirement plans in Taiwan? Do they offer any special options for long-term immigrants?
Yes. Taiwan has a pension system that's similar to those found in other developed countries. Expats can contribute to a pension fund and enjoy a range of benefits, including a guaranteed minimum pension.
That sounds like a great option for expats. And what about social safety nets in Taiwan? Do they offer any protections for long-term immigrants?
Well, Mira, Taiwan has a comprehensive social safety net that includes healthcare, education, and unemployment benefits. Expats are eligible for these benefits, but they may need to meet certain requirements.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any information on the social safety net in Taiwan. Now, let's talk about the pros and cons of each country's tax system.
Yes, Mira. The Marshall Islands tax system is relatively simple, but it may not offer the same level of tax incentives as Taiwan. On the other hand, Taiwan's tax system is more complex, but it offers a range of tax credits and incentives for expats.
I see. So it sounds like the choice between the Marshall Islands and Taiwan depends on one's individual circumstances and priorities. But what about our listeners? Have any of them experienced the tax system in the Marshall Islands or Taiwan?
Yes. Mira, I'm sure our listeners would love to share their experiences and offer any advice to others. Perhaps we can get some feedback in the comments section of our podcast.
That's a great idea. Leo. And finally, let's summarize the key points for our listeners.
Yes. Mira, to summarize, the Marshall Islands have a relatively simple tax system, but limited pension options and a basic social safety net. Taiwan, on the other hand, has a more complex tax system, but offers a range of tax incentives and a comprehensive social safety net.
And as broadcast on taxation, retirement, and social rights for long-term immigrants in the Marshall Islands and Taiwan. Thanks for joining us. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more informative and entertaining content.
Yes, Mira. And don't forget to check out our website for more information on the Marshall Islands in Taiwan, including their tax systems, pension plans, and social safety nets.
And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, Mira. And finally, thanks to our listeners for tuning into today's podcast. We'll be back with more exciting content soon.
And until next time, stay informed and keep laughing. Let's dive into the fascinating world of Marshall Islands and Taiwan, two countries with unique cultures and interests. I'm to share with you the rate of meeting specific interests in these two nations. Leo, let's start with Marshall Islands. What do you know about this country's niche hobby clubs?
Marshall Islands. I have heard they have a vibrant community of traditional handicraft enthusiasts. They're known for their intricate wood carvings, shell jewelry, and woven mats. I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about these unique crafts.
That's fascinating. I've also heard that the Marshall Islands have a strong tradition of storytelling and music. In fact, their traditional dance, the Iniko, is a beautiful blend of music and dance. Leo, have you heard about the Iniko?
Yes, I have. The Iniko is a traditional dance that tells the story of the Marshall Islands' history and culture. It's a beautiful expression of their heritage, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it.
Absolutely. And speaking of heritage, I'm curious to know more about Taiwan's cultural scene. What do you know about Taiwan's niche hobby clubs? Leo?
Taiwan. They have a thriving community of hobbyists, from model train enthusiasts to vintage car collectors. And let's not forget their love of food. Taiwan is famous for its night markets, where you can find everything from street food to handmade crafts.
Wow, that sounds like a foodie's paradise. I've also heard that Taiwan has a strong tradition of calligraphy and brush painting. In fact, their traditional art form, shanshui, is a beautiful blend of landscape painting and calligraphy. Leo, have you heard about shanshui?
Yes, I have. Shanshui is a traditional art form that originated in China, but has been adopted and adapted by Taiwanese artists. It's a beautiful expression of their cultural heritage, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it.
I'm sure they would. And speaking of cultural heritage, I'm curious to know more about Taiwan's community engagement. What do you know about Taiwan's community centers and cultural festivals? Leo?
Taiwan's community centers and cultural festivals are a great way to experience their vibrant culture. From traditional festivals like the Dragon Boat Festival to modern events like the Taipei Lantern Festival, there's always something going on in Taiwan.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. And finally, let's talk about Marshall Islands community engagement. What do you know about their traditional dance performances and cultural events? Leo?
Marshall Islands' traditional dance performances are a highlight of their cultural scene. From the Iniko to other traditional dances like the Koentao. They're a beautiful expression of their heritage.
I'm sure they are. And that's all the time we have for today's episode. I want to thank our listeners for joining us on this journey through the rate of meeting specific interests in Marshall Islands and Taiwan. We hope you've learned something new and interesting about these two countries.
Absolutely. And we'd love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts, comments, and critiques below. Reading and responding to them truly brightens our day.
Don't forget to follow the Jet Off our YouTube channel for more episodes like this. Hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop and be among the first to listen.
And take care and see you in the next one. Warmest wishes from us.
It was a pleasure joining you all on this journey. Stay curious and keep exploring the rate of meeting specific interests.
And remember, as we always say, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the right country. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, stay tuned and keep exploring.